All right, well, thank you so much. Just a few opening remarks to my fellow economists, students, friends of UC San Diego, our broader Southern California community. Welcome. Thank you for being here today. My name is Ach Advaryu. I'm the director of the 21st Century India Center at UC San Diego's School of Global Policy and Strategy. Before we get started here, I just want to say a few words about the India Center and the sort of purpose of the event, why we're here today. It'll be patently obvious to most folks in this room and really any room that no understanding of the world, none of the grand challenges that we face globally today, whether it's preventing and dealing with pandemics, building prosperity and justice for folks who've historically been left behind, mitigating and adapting to climate change, harnessing new technologies, ensuring regional and national security. None of these can happen without an essential role for India. India, as you all know, now has the largest population of any country in the world. It'll soon be the third largest economy in the world. It produces more than 1.5 million engineering graduates a year, which is the most in the world. It has the strongest digital payments infrastructure in the world. Yet, fundamental challenges remain in India's development path. 60 million Indian children are stunted. Of students in grade 5, more than a half can't read a grade 2 level text, and more than 3/4 can't do simple division. Less than 1 in 3 Indian women participates in the labor force. And this is all against the backdrop of challenges to democracy at a time when India is holding what many estimate will be the largest elections ever to be held in recorded history, with 970 million eligible voters. So understanding India, its economy, its government, its policies, its people, is of vital interest not only for India, but also for the world order, and especially for the United States. The UC San Diego 21st Century India Center was conceptualized as, in part, an answer to that call for greater understanding. We aim to provide a set of global public goods that collectively promote more research, education and knowledge exchange, and a tighter connection between research and real-world action related to India and US-India relations. Today, we've brought together some of the top economic minds in the world to discuss the most important opportunities and challenges that the Indian economy is going to face in the coming decades. These kind of events tend to live in the realm of platitudes. So we thought it would be most productive to have a conversation that's sort of laser-focused on our role as academics that highlights not only what we've learned thus far, but also where more research is needed and how it could move the needle on issues that are relevant to India's economic future. Because the questions that we ask and how rooted those questions are in the real world is just as important as the rigor with which we answer those questions. So my hope for the event is that we come out of today with a concrete understanding not only of critical insights that have emerged from all the work that's been done by the wonderful folks in this room and others around the world on India, but also a roadmap for which questions and which agendas have the highest marginal value with respect to driving informed decision-making in India and with regard to US-India relations. So we've divided this event into 2 sessions. The first is going to be a panel discussion on several key areas of the Indian economy in which you're going to hear from a wonderful set of experts. I'll just take a moment to introduce them and tell you about the panel, and we'll go ahead with the panel, and then I'll tell you about the next session. Our panelists are Andrew Foster, who's the George and Nancy Parker Professor of Economics at Brown, and he's going to be talking about structural transformation, i.e. agriculture. Carolyn Freund, who is our very own dean at the UC San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy, and she's going to be talking about trade. Seema Jayachandran, who's professor of economics and public affairs at Princeton. She's going to be talking about gender and discrimination. Emily Briza, who is the Frederick E. Abbey Professor of Economics at Harvard. She's going to be talking about finance. And Pranab Bardhan, who is the Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Economics at Berkeley, and he's going to be talking about political economy. So each panelist is going to have 10 minutes, which I know is an impossible task for many of us here, to discuss where we are with regard to India's economy with respect to their area of expertise, and to highlight optimal research inputs in their topical areas in the coming decades. And then perhaps also discuss some real-world constraints that we might face in achieving these goals. This is going to be followed with a 30-minute Q&A with the audience and amongst the panelists. And then we'll have a brief coffee and snacks break, and then I'll introduce the second session, which will be a keynote address by Michael Kremer, who's the University Professor of Economics at the University of Chicago, and a special lecture by our own Karthik Muralidharan, who is the Tata Chancellor's Endowed Professor of Economics at UC San Diego. So I'll introduce Michael and Karthik properly when I begin the second session. So without further ado, let's welcome our panel and give the floor to Andrew to kick things off. Thank you for joining us.
All right. All right, so I just let me start off. I want to give you a little background and maybe point you to where I think we need to be thinking a little differently than we have been. So as the editor of a major development journal, one of the things I noticed about 5 years ago is that a lot of papers started putting structural change or structural transformation in their papers. It wasn't that the content of the papers had changed. They just added the word, okay? And I was sort of curious about that, so I looked on Google Trends, and sure enough, about 5-6 years ago, you saw a big jump within India on discussion of structural change. So that word has become very popular, okay? And there's no doubt, and I'm going to focus on rural India. There are other people who are better positioned to talk about what's going on in urban areas, but I think, half the population is rural, and I think that's what there's a lot to be learned from that. So there's a lot going on in rural India that over the last almost 20 years, the agricultural labor force, it's peaked about 260 million in 2014. It's now down to about 122 million, at least as of the 2019 survey. So it's down quite a bit. Some of that sort of slack has been taken up by the service sector within rural areas, largely non-tradable services. And then that's from 49 to 69 million, and another 20 million of sort of focused on construction activities. Okay, so there's, as I say, there's a lot going on in India. And there's a tendency for, I think, economists to think about structural transformation as simply about the conversion from agriculture to perhaps industry and perhaps services, in India's case. But I think the classical writers had something different in mind. They had an idea that structural transformation was about to change the nature of productive relationships in the economy. And I want to sort of suggest that we should think a little bit more about whether that's happening in rural India. Okay? So let me put it this way. If a self-employed farmer opens a self-employed business, okay, has his activity really changed? It's basically the same nature of business, it's just applied to a different market, perhaps. Or if a casual worker who is working as an agricultural laborer is suddenly now working as a construction worker, has the nature of his activity really changed? Do we really want to think of that as structural transformation? And if not, how do we make that happen if that's something that we want to happen? Okay, so that's what I want to think about. And I don't want to get into it. This is not really about a semantic debate. We're not debating about whether this is structural transformation or not. But I think when we think about sort of the classical notion of development, we think of it a place where the nature of production activities change. And the traditional classical authors didn't have the data to think separately about sort of the transition from agriculture to industry versus the change in the nature of production within structures. But we do have that data, and we can do, I think, more in that. Okay, let me just go over here. Okay, so in terms of the so that's the question I want to put to you: is has sort of structural transformation happened in India over the last 10 to 20 years? Okay, now the biggest contra-argument has got to be in the context of the sector of land. Okay, so I noted that the agricultural labor as a whole has declined. Okay, but one of the things that's less recognized is the number of cultivators has increased. Okay, the number of cultivators increased from 138 million to 165 million from 1994 to 2019. There's more cultivators. The amount of land hasn't expanded very much. What does that mean? That means farm sizes have gotten smaller. Okay. And that's indeed the case if you look at the data. In the 60s, you had farms of around 2 hectares. In the last 10 years, it's fallen from about the average, based on the data that I've seen from the NSS, is from 0.806 to 0.556 hectares. These farms are getting smaller. Okay, and you know, there's a question about whether that represents the kind of structural transformation that we might be looking for, even if the labor force is shifting from one place to the other. Now, if you look at Indian policy documents, they're replete with sort of mentions of the problems of the small scale of agriculture. Now, some of it has focused on the issues of productivity differences, an issue that I have written extensively on, and many have as well. Okay? But another point that is simply made is that even if there aren't important productivity differentials between small and large farmers, small farmers will never, if their primary income is based on cultivation, will have incomes that will allow them to sort of grow with the economy at large. If their farms are small, their incomes will be small unless they're doing something else. And so, as I say, the policy documents focus a lot on that issue. A very interesting policy document, and I think is the Doubling Income Commission reports. There's a series of reports. I'm not sure how many of you are aware of those. They're wonderful policy documents. In fact, there are 300 or so recommendations, each of them with a specific thing that should be done, and even the particular actor that should do it. Okay? And if you look at the current reports from the Indian government, they say, you know, this is what we spent. Okay? There's not very much discussion about whether it worked or not. Okay? So I think, you know, that is an important sort of message. You could take a whole team of graduate students and just go to work on that one report, and I think you would learn a lot that would be useful in terms of thinking about what we need to get rural transformation. Are these policies of doubling income? Which ones are working, which are not? How can we make them work better? Okay? Just to mention two specifically, one is the Farmer Producers Organization. There's a lot of emphasis. In fact, in the last few years, there's been this emphasis on Farmer Producers Organization. What's the point? The point is the recognition that small-scale farms have difficulty being competitive on a number of scales. So by using the cooperative model, perhaps it's possible to capture some of those returns to scale with a bunch of smaller farmers. The point is, unless there's large productivity advantages, that's not going to raise incomes of smaller farmers, so that's a concern. But the bottom line is we don't really know their work, and given the checkered history of cooperatives in India, my guess is some will work and some will not. Again, that's something that should be looked at, that we should study, we should try to better understand. On aggregate, if you look at the data, you don't see much evidence of them doing much, but individual ones we could probably learn something from. Another thing that sort of popped out of the report is the PM Kisan subsidy. It's basically a subsidy of 6,000 rupees for every household, regardless of farm size, as long as they have cultivable land. Okay? And if you can think of a policy that would be less likely to create the kind of structural change in transformation of the agricultural sector than that, I'm interested to hear what it would be. Right? You're paying people to hold on to small amounts of land. Okay? I'm not saying that the welfare concerns are not good, but you have to think about the consequences of such a change. Again, that's something that we ought to think about. Okay, so let's see. Let me see where I want to go. Okay, so another thing that is often discussed in the context of this issue of structural transformation of rural areas is the very important role that government subsidies have played. You know, my understanding is a couple of trillion rupees before COVID. It spiked up to 6 or 7, as it did in many countries, trillion rupees during COVID. But what's interesting in India is the data suggests that it hasn't come back down again. That sort of subsidies to the rural sector are 5 or 6 trillion rupees. Okay, and so what does that mean? Well, it means from the perspective of demand that there's a big increase in demand, and that demand has increased demand for non-tradable goods in rural areas, and that has caused, say, increases in construction in all likelihood and so forth. That's something that we might, in some sense, call structural change. But the question is, has it really changed the nature of the economy? Okay, so just to put Kartik on the spot for a moment. So in his paper on general equilibrium effects, he shows that bringing more income to the rural economy has all these salutary effects in terms of increasing demand and increasing activity. Okay, but if you look at the effect on the non-farm sector, which he does call structural transformation in his paper, it's a bunch of growth of single-employee firms. Okay, that for me is not structural transformation. Okay? And so I think we need to be thinking about what is going to change in the consciousness of the rural sector in order to see the kind of transformation that we want or that people might want. Of course, that's a decision for them to make, not for me to make, but I think we need to understand the distinction that I'm trying to make here. Okay? So with that said, what does this also open up? I mean, I think one of the questions the agricultural sector arises is that the small farmers are holding on to land in large part as a speculative asset, something they use to buy and sell. And the question is, what is going to change the circumstances so small farmers are comfortable giving up that as a key secure asset? Okay? And so I think there are important things to think about in terms of credit access, education, mobility, diversification of incomes that all might play a role there. Another thing that the literature sort of emphasized, and I don't want to steal Seema's thunder a little bit, but is that if you look at the agricultural labor force, the people who are moving into the non-farm sector are largely men and educated. 80% of women who are employed, who are working, at least generating income for the household, are doing so in agriculture. And there's some discussion of people holding on to farms because it's the one place that they're comfortable having women working, right? And so it sort of raises the interesting question about whether, sort of, as has been the case in many countries, the movement of women from one place into the labor force more formally, perhaps as single employees, but more likely as part of sort of larger tradable businesses, might in some ways be a source of structural transformation in the long run. So let me thought that. I'm happy to pick all these things up later in discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And before I jump into talking about trade, I just want to say that we have an incredible team here at the School of Global Policy and Strategy in the 21st Century India Center working on the economy of India, on environment in India, on trade and investment relations with the US, on security, et cetera. And we really want this to be the place to study the Indian economy here. I'm very excited to be part of this first kind of large academic event we're doing for the India Center here. But I'm also a little intimidated because I'm not an India expert. I'm a trade economist, and both in my writing as well as in my time at the World Bank, I've spent time in India, so I do know India. But I'm certainly by no means an expert like the others here. But the trade story is pretty simple, so my job is also pretty easy. India is a really poor performer when it comes to trade. Protectionism has been and continues to be a real problem, and in some ways is even getting worse. US-China decoupling is a huge opportunity for India. And India's benefiting, but it could gain more. And just to say, it's really stuck between China and India. Its biggest export partner, so the country in India's, as an exporter, its main partner is the US, but as an importer, its main partner is China. So it's very much between the two. But the way economists often look at a country and examine their export potential is to say, well, it's dependent on the size of the economy and how close it is to other big economies. So we have this thing called the gravity equation that fits trade remarkably well. So it just sort of says trade is related to the size of the two economies that are trading and the distance between them for any two parties, and then you can aggregate it up and think about how much that country should trade. Well, if you do that for India, and this is a goods exports, not really a services exports thing. If you do that for India, India trades about half as much as it should. So it's missing what could be a doubling of its exports. Just to put that in context, India's goods exports relative to GDP is 13%. Compared to 20% for China, but China is a bigger economy, and usually larger economies have smaller shares, actually, because they can produce more themselves. India accounts for less than 2% of global exports, compared to 15% for China. Even Mexico's a country that's like 10% of India, accounts for more of global exports, around 2%. So just to put in context, India is a really bad performer when it comes to goods trade. Part of the reason for that is protectionism. So the average tariff in India is 18%, the highest among the large kind of emerging markets, even higher than Brazil and Argentina, the countries that are the worst performers in this hemisphere. As a comparison, the average tariff in China is 7.5%. In a country like Indonesia, it's 8%. And tariffs have been increasing. So in recent years, they've actually been going up. India is the #1 user in the world of anti-dumping, so putting restrictions on countries because their exports to India increase too fast. It's also become a huge user of export controls. So during times when there's huge demand for some food products, countries like to preserve those for their own citizens, which might make sense, except if every country did it, it really makes prices much more volatile and hurts those in the countries with scarce produce much more. This poor performance on trade is also really a problem for participation in global value chains. So global value chains really allow a country to specialize in whatever it can produce most efficiently. But you need imports to export. So in order for China to start getting into electronics, it imports the high-end components or semiconductors or these kinds of things, and then eventually moves up the value chain. So India's been left behind in value chains because, in part, of this high protection. And it's even holding itself back in the service sector. I'm going to talk about that more later, but where it could do well by doing really weird things like putting protection on laptops and tablets and personal computers and things like that, exactly where it has comparative advantage that it would need those inputs for its people, but because it wants its own sector, it has started to regulate those. I was really happy to hear what Professor Foster said, because for trade, you also need these kind of behind the border and business regulations to be good. And that's been a big part of holding back trade as well, is too much focus on small. So for some reason, there's a love of small enterprise, that this is the way to change things. Those great SMEs are gonna change everything. But you also need scale for productivity. And there's a great example from India. They used to reserve certain products in apparel for small companies. So only companies under 10 people or something like that were allowed to produce. Might even have been smaller than that. Between 97, I think it was, and 2007, they got rid of those restrictions. Companies could grow, jobs grew, productivity increased, and now India's actually a player in apparel. It could not possibly do that with only little tiny enterprises. You need exactly that kind of transformation. So I've been really negative. I'm going to say some good things now. There are some green shoots. So India's benefiting from U.S.-China decoupling. If you look at what's happening, China between 2017, when trade was at its max between U.S. and China, China since then has lost 8 percentage points of U.S. imports. So from like 22% to 14% now. Just China's share, at least of direct, we might get China content from other countries, but of direct imports, it's fallen a lot. India has picked up 0.5 percentage point. So that's actually pretty big. It puts it about number 6. But countries like Vietnam and Mexico, which are much smaller, have picked up more. Where India's done surprisingly well is picking up lots of little products. So where where Vietnam and Mexico will pick up a lot of volume in a really important product, India will pick up lots of little products where it can become the most important exporter. We call it the extensive margin in trade. So India's doing okay there. The other huge bright spot is services, in part because countries haven't really figured out how to tax services as well, and services don't have to go on the roads and through the ports and all that logistics that's so complex in India. So the trade surplus in services, exactly from the call centers you reach. I know Qualcomm has a huge amount of employees in India, reduces the goods deficit by about half. And it's likely to boost, mid-skilled labor and so forth. I think there is a risk with AI coming in about how beneficial it will be for the low-skilled labor. So lastly, Utch asked us to say something about the big questions. One is around this services trade. Unfortunately, we economists spend so much time studying goods trade because we can see it. So we can measure it. We know exactly how many white women's T-shirts come through the port in LA. I mean, literally to that degree of precision. With services for India, all we know is an aggregate number. For the US-India service trade, we can break it down a bit more because US breaks it down into some, 10 categories or something. But we really need better data on that to understand if this can be the new manufacturing that leads to growth. And then just going to the other sections, I think a lot is really about the politics. Why is it that other countries got past import substitution and India just has not? And I'll stop there. Thanks.
All right. So Ach asked me to talk about groups that are traditionally disadvantaged, and that applies to caste and religion and gender. I'm going to focus on gender, but the broader theme here is that with structural transformation or with trade, we want the economy to be bigger, but we also want there to be equality or in how that prosperity is enjoyed, and particularly certain groups where there might be discrimination. So, on the story of gender, there's some bright spots, there's some positive things, positive points to make, and there's been a lot of progress, but there's also been some regress in areas, and certainly there's a lot more that needs to be done. Compared to other countries in similar shape of the economy, stage of development, India has worse gender gaps than those peers on other dimensions. So, the examples of the gains have been things like reductions in the gender gap in infant mortality. Why did that arise? A lot of these gains are coming just through growth and prosperity. As overall mortality decreases, there's more scope for it to decrease for girls because there was such a higher rate of infant mortality to begin with. Or female education. There are more girls completing secondary school or enrolled in secondary school than boys in India. I have a project in Haryana, which is known as one of the more discriminatory states, and that fact is true even there. And so, and those education gains have come also through prosperity, both government efforts of school building, parents having the income, but also concerted gender-focused policies like the one Karthik and co-author studied about bicycles for girls to go to school. And so I think, just broadly to achieve this progress that still needs to be made, we're going to need more growth, but we're also going to need policies that tackle that think about these disadvantages for girls and women and try to address them. And a lot of my recent research, and I think probably some of the graduate students in the room, it's sort of in the air, is how do you also change the underlying attitudes and gender norms that led to these problems in the first place. So not just kind of the workaround, but changing hearts and minds, so to speak. So I'm going to talk about 3 areas where there are important gender gaps, where there is research, there's need for more research, but that are just important for India. So the first one's already been alluded to, which is, Ach mentioned it, which is female employment. So, there's somewhere high 20s, low 30s rate of female employment in India. That's much lower than most other countries. So Vietnam, Caroline just mentioned Vietnam. Vietnam is a very similar GDP per capita and has over twice the female employment rate. I think right now the last few years, I think there's more and more policy attention and even academic attention saying it's about jobs. What's missing is that there just aren't enough jobs. I'm a skeptic of that being the only explanation because, it can't explain why India is such an outlier compared to other countries. And if you look at the places that have very low female employment around the world, they're places that have restrictions on female mobility, that have some value on female purity, that practice female seclusion. So that's North Africa, the Middle East, India, Pakistan. It's hard to kind of look at a map where female labor force participation is really low and not see this strong correlation with female seclusion. And if you have survey questions that are asked around the world about whether women or men will make good business executives, India is an outlier in attitudes that men are better at those roles. So one of the things, one of the areas or puzzles that I think is an opportunity is that I have this project in Haryana that I mentioned where women are about 20. They almost all finish secondary school, so people are getting married at 21, 22, and there you have this secondary school educated population that's kind of a lot of them are doing nothing outside the home for those 4 or 5 years. So, half of them are neither in college nor working. So that's where I see an opportunity to, and I think probably part of the challenge is it's a negative signal on the marriage market to work. But, from a GDP, I guess where I see the political coalition to make progress is you have this real talent base that, maybe they won't work after they're married, but these 4 or 5 years of working between finishing secondary school and getting married, I think could be great for personal development, gaining self-esteem, gaining kind of the skills that will allow you to be, kind of happier and have more power in your household later. I think there are a bunch of other policies around female labor force participation, around, kind of safety in public spaces, and I think, there's a lot of work right now, probably some people in this room are doing work on kind of norms about husbands not wanting their wives to work and how do we change those norms. A second big area that I haven't worked on, but I think is something that, it's a research agenda that someone should pick up and work on, is thinking about the economic empowerment of women in rural areas. A lot of this job growth and a lot of the work on female employment is about, women who are in, making our iPhones for Foxconn or, those kind of jobs. But half the population is in rural areas, and there isn't going to be, a lot of job growth. And so, how do we get women to have some control over economic resources or get some of the benefits that we think accrue from economic empowerment, like an ability to walk away from an abusive marriage or, just have more say in how the household is spending money. And so, India has invested in these self-help groups, which are aimed at some sort of, low-level, modest financial empowerment for women, but, thinking of those as a platform to do more. Or, I don't know the answer, but I do think I'm sort of not clear, it's not clear to me kind of where the evidence is on kind of really how to help those women, until those families move to towns or there's more non-agriculture in those areas. I'll mention kind of another area where I think India is an outlier besides employment is, related, which is intimate partner violence. So I think that's another one where kind of thinking about the link between employment and intimate partner violence and how you solve that problem is important. The last thing I'll talk about as is thinking more about kids and how parents treat sons versus daughters. And this is where I've done a lot of my research. And as I mentioned, with education, there's been huge progress. Why has there been progress? Partly up through secondary school. There's pretty high returns in the marriage market for being educated, and it's the cost of there's some incentives to send kids to school, but there's still gaps in other areas. So health, for example, where you see that parents are more likely to give milk or eggs to their sons and their daughters, kind of relative to other poor countries, there's more stunting and malnutrition of girls than boys. Pascaline Dupont and Radhika Jain have work that shows, with health insurance where healthcare is free, parents are less likely to take their daughters to get that healthcare than their sons. And so I think that's a big policy challenge of these decisions that are made inside the household. How do you get equality in the household? We can do things where once people are living outside the home, I think there's policies that can be done, in Anganwadi centers of giving food. Does that, how much gets crowded out at home versus how much can you do outside the home to narrow those gaps? What sort of policies will encourage parents to invest in their daughters as much as they invest in their sons? The other big indicator where India is a depressing outlier is on the skewed sex ratio, the fact that people are having abortions of female fetuses. I'm sort of a pessimist on this because I think it's going to it's very bad in the rich states in India that have very low fertility and where people can afford abortions. I think in Bihar, when fertility goes from 3 to 2, the not having a son is going to happen more often naturally. And so I think, kind of thinking about, here I don't know the answer. As I said, I've kind of worked on gender norms, but that's, there's probably other, many other kinds of policies that could change the way parents feel the need to have a son. So some of it is the status symbol, and maybe there you want to change norms. Some of it is some practical reasons to want to have a son, and so some policy substitutes for that might be important. And the last point I'll make is, again, because I think it's a good question if there are any graduate students who are thinking of research ideas, is that, I mentioned that education has a return on the marriage market. It's always puzzling to me, why health doesn't have a return as well. There are actually kind of observable markers of height. It feeds in, if you think a lot of this is you want a daughter-in-law who's going to raise your grandkids well, women, there are a lot fewer childbirth complications for women who are well-nourished and healthy. And I don't even know the policy solution because I don't know what the explanation for it. But kind of thinking about ways that maybe the marriage market can be part of the answer of encouraging kind of more investment in daughters. So I think that I hope part of solving this problem is kind of acknowledging it. And so I think there are some areas where India has closed gender gaps, but it's hard to miss that it's still one of the the really dark spots on India's current situation. So thanks a lot.
Okay, so I'm going to break the trend and have some slides, right? What? You wanted me to be positive? I'll be positive too. So that's why I need the slides, because the slides are telling such a positive story. Okay, so I'm talking about finance, and there's been this huge stuff going on in India. And that's all coming from the thing that's cut off on the top, the so-called JAM Trinity. A is Aadhaar, and Karthik's work has spoken to the importance of authenticating identification, and that's been the base for being able to do the J, the access to bank accounts, and then also mobile, and then I'm going to talk about digital payments. Okay, so the top, this is global, from the World Bank's Global Findex. This is global account ownership around the world. And from 2011 to 2021, it went from 51% to 76%. It's just really huge closing of the global gap. And the really interesting fact when you read these reports is that especially between 2014 and 2017, most of this is India. So most of this, that's 8 percentage points globally and 5 percentage points that alone is India's Jan Dhan savings accounts. And so in the bottom, this breaks out India. Account ownership went from 35% in 2011 to about close to 80% in 2021. So just really tremendous access to finance. Mobile phones have been similar. This is the M in JAM. In 2023, there were 1 billion smartphone users in India, and this came out of nowhere. There have been large infrastructure investments and very low-priced data products so that smartphones and data are accessible to huge chunks of society. And then finally, the big one that is, I think, really an interesting research opportunity is UPI. And this is the free instantaneous payments that all you need is a bank account, a mobile phone, and linking the two. And then this is fully interoperable with any other bank account on the platform. And so, sorry, the labels are really tiny. This was launched in 2016. It gained some speed after demonetization. It gained more speed after COVID. And there are 330 million unique users, and there are 13 billion monthly transactions. So this is just a huge change in the financial landscape. And where is this actually seeming to matter most? This very similar thing has happened in Brazil. It's things like corner stores, retailers, where now people are using the QR code. They're posting a QR code in the window. They're making a payment with their phone, and these are pretty small transactions. So the average size is $20, but the median is going to be much, much smaller. So this is now potentially revolutionizing the small businesses, all of these little family small entrepreneurs. Okay, so this ties, this opportunity, this really rapid recent increase in digital payments ties into some places where the academic literature has sort of arrived and looking for how to push it. So one of the results that seems to be pretty consistent across settings is that in a lot of developing country contexts, there isn't sufficient access to formal credit. But it's quite hard to try to do something about that with the formal banking model. There's a lot of heterogeneity. Some people want to borrow for consumption. Some people want to borrow for their business. And some people, but that business, they don't necessarily want it to grow, just maybe some working capital. And then some people actually have an idea and a way to scale it and a way to maybe hire workers and really make that business grow. And so I think it's been a big problem with a lack of data to try to even figure out, well, if I'm a financial intermediary, how do I get my money back? That's going to be a really big problem. And then how do I even have any basis for picking those high productivity businesses versus the consumption borrowers? What does UPI do? If these are corner stores, now now a lot of the revenues are coming from other people's bank transactions. India also has an open banking infrastructure to share these account statements. So now I'm a lender, I'm a fintech lender, or I'm a bank. I have access to people's UPI inflows. I see a measure of revenues. I know something about these businesses. And maybe even better yet, I can build a contract that is tied to revenues, or I can allow more default in certain circumstances versus others. So the screening part's already happening. There's a very nice paper by some people at the RBI and also an economist at Duke showing that in this early phase of adoption in 2017, 2018, certain banks were on it and certain banks weren't. And the places that had more of those banks that were early adopters saw much bigger increases in credit, especially coming from fintechs. And so, fintechs are using this. The credit supply seems to have expanded, and I think that opens up a lot of questions. It's probably not necessarily the case that the private sector is designing the best product for somebody's needs. How do we think about consumer protection, and how do we think about, not just the high interest rate credit, but also steering people into maybe a savings account if all they want is a consumption product. So that's the finding, and this is already speaking to that and filling that gap. The second is something I've already alluded to, which is contract structure and flexibility. So banks have historically, when they're giving a farmer a loan or an auto rickshaw driver, they're going to give a collateralized term loan. That's a pretty rigid product. A lot of people won't have the collateral. That was the whole idea of microfinance. Microfinance gives a rigid loan where you actually have to start repaying maybe a week later or a month later. And there's been some very nice research in many settings that show that actually holds back profitable investments. People don't do as much with the money inside of their business if they have that repayment pressure right away. So giving some flexibility might actually be very useful. And that's just even moving a very small way towards something that looks like risky debt or something that's like equity, that's state contingent repayment. Now that you see revenues coming into people's accounts, one could, in theory, be much more creative with the kinds of products. One could think about the timing of the cash flows. When in the year do we see the inflows and the outflows, and maybe design something around that. Or maybe toying around with thinking about moving in this direction of more flexibility. Now, like, there are a lot of issues. You could put up your brother's QR code in your store window to evade repayment, but I do think that it's a space now that's worth thinking about, and some creativity, I think, could go a long way. Okay, third, this has come up in everybody's conversations, an important piece of the finance literature kind of up until this point where we now have UPI has been to think about financial inclusion to promote gender equity. And I think a lot of the takeaways there have been women need their own accounts, women need control over the funds they're getting from microcredit. And what I worry about a bit is if women don't have equal access to smartphones and women don't have equal access to UPI, then the husband is getting the data trail, the husband's getting the potential lending benefits. And so I think this is something we need to explore. Who are the billion people who haven't adopted yet? Is there a gender divide there? And I think just more disaggregated data on what policy levers need to be pulled to make sure that this is growing in an equitable way. And so I think there's some interesting, just data we need to see first, and then some interesting work that I'm sure could come out of that. And then finally, one other theme from the literature is that, despite people who are kind of at the fringes of the formal financial sector having small loans, some of them, only consuming and not doing great things with it, there is some evidence that there are market-level impacts of relaxing credit constraints. And so I think, what are the market-level impacts of this great expansion in digital payments? If there's a big credit supply increase that goes along with it, are there kind of financial stability concerns that we want to think about? What's happening to banks vis-a-vis fintechs? How is the new competition affecting, how these different types of institutions are functioning? And so I think there's just a huge set of questions to be asked on this. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for inviting me. I'm the guy who's supposed to be talking politics. That's why I don't hesitate talking politics. And by the way, I'm also going to use some slides. Don't expect that I'm going to be all positive. Okay, so political economy, I can think of 30, 40 different questions. Given the time, I will just flag 4 issues. The first issue is what was about structural transition. I'm using it in the traditional sense of from low productivity activities to high productivity activities. It's been largely aborted in India. A lot of people think that India has missed the bus in manufacturing. And some people think skill-intensive service export is the only hope. Of course, there's a severe deficit in skill promotion, and vocational programs, that deficit too, block the way. And global market potential for manufacturers is low now. In Indian domestic market then, forget about export market, if there's not that much prospect, is Indian domestic market large enough for the necessary economies of scale and learning? Some people think so. In fact, if I remember right, Peggy Goldberg, I think recently her presidential address in the Econometric Society came out in Econometrica. Peggy seems to give the impression that India may just be the size where it's possible to grow a lot with the domestic market alone. I have my doubts, but this is a research question. I think this really needs to be explored. And in doing a model of India, growth model of India, it has to be extreme inequality and demand deficiency as a result of that. has to be built in. Some people don't realize how extreme is Indian inequality. If you look at wealth inequality, by some measures, India is now among the topmost extreme inequality, next probably to Brazil and South Africa in terms of wealth inequality. But that wealth inequality is physical wealth. It does not include human capital. If you take human capital, if you measure in a very crude way, like Gini of adult years in schooling, India is the world's most unequal country. So if you combine physical wealth and human capital, India is probably up there, is among the most unequal countries in the world. And it has the implication in terms of a growth model, in terms of demand deficiency. And I think any such model of India has to incorporate what I call the essential structural duality of an enclave economy. And let me spell it out a little more. India is an economy where a limited sector caters to an affluent elite, demanding relatively capital-intensive and skill-intensive goods. Whereas much of the general economy, primarily informal, suffers from insufficient demand and underutilization of capacity, and thus low private investment and productive employment. This, I think, is an essential feature, must appear in any growth model of India. But I haven't seen too many growth models of that kind in India. And of course, part of the low investment, private investment, and unemployment and underemployment, which is much more important, because in a poor country that you cannot afford to be unemployed quite often, particularly in the burgeoning population of the youth, are reaching alarming proportions, as most people know. Yet, there are large capital subsidies in the name of encouraging investment that, along with more labor-replacing nature of new technology, distort a firm's choice in hiring decisions. One question to explore in my mind, is there a case for substantial wage subsidies replacing much of the capital subsidies? I've now seen no study on that in India. My second political economy issue is, of course, governance. Now, their obvious issue is state capacity. I have a paper in Journal of Economic Literature some years back on the state, and I talk about 4 types of state capacity: organizational, technical, fiscal, political. Taking just the fiscal tax GDP ratio is quite low, keeping the Indian state fiscally weak and dysfunctional. Just to give an example, the number of civilian employees per 1,000 people is less than half of that in the United States, not to speak of Europe. Of course, one reason is large informal sector, which is below the direct tax radar. Then even in the formal sector, taxes on capital and wealth are unusually low. I call India a land of hereditary plutocracy, with extreme wealth inequality, but zero inheritance and zero wealth taxes. Subsidies to the better off estimated to be almost 8% of GDP. Another important feature of the governance structure is vertical fiscal balance. And there was some change, politically and economically. In the quarter century of 89 to 2014, with powerful regional political parties and coalition governments in New Delhi, the imbalance in Indian fiscal arrangements, the vertical fiscal imbalance, was partly corrected through negotiations, because the coalition governments depended on these regional parties. But these corrections were not institutionalized. Now those arrangements are largely discarded, and federalism is now being battered by the central government in various ways. The vertical fiscal imbalance is particularly severe between the state level and that of local urban bodies and village councils. Local property tax, for example, as percentage of GDP, is one of the lowest in the whole world. And yet, I haven't seen many studies of this. Very little devolution of power downward from the state governments. For example, in India's major cities, urban planning and development projects are designed and run by agencies controlled by the state governments with no accountability to the elected municipal bodies, leading to a great deal of misalignment and dysfunctionality. The burning issue of Indian governance is extreme centralization of political power, which is economically and socially incongruent with the largest and one of the most diverse populations in the world. And then the battle of Indians, hence the battle of Indian federalism. And I may say that federalism, battered as it is one of the last remaining checks on Indian authoritarianism. Depending on the results of the ongoing elections, a major battle is shaping up, as most of you know, around the delimitation time. So I think it's worth exploring even for academics. What will be the nature of compromise in the distribution of political and economic power in India, particularly between the demographically weightier north and the economically weightier south? What should be the nature of the compromise? I think it's worth exploring. For the current ruling party wins big, if the current party wins big and tries to change the constitution or even implement one nation, one election, what will happen to Indian regional pluralism? Don't forget that the predecessor of this current party, which used to be called Jan Sangh, did not agree to the linguistic reorganization of the state in the 1950s. So what attitude will they take to my third one, sharply increasing corporate concentration? There's a lot of data on that. I think it's worth understanding, why is this corporate concentration increasing? Is it just the regulatory favors to crony capitalists? How much of it is difficulties of raising long-term finance? And how much of this is to economies of scale? There are various reasons: regional integration, big data, network externalities, and so on. All of this drove out much of regional capital, which thrived in the period that I mentioned. Very little positive effects of this concentration on productivity as opposed to profits, which is one of the reasons of low competitiveness and thus the fear of joining regional trade agreements. Also, this concentration leads to neglect of R&D, which in the Indian private sector is one of the lowest even among developing countries. My last fourth political economy point I want to talk about is politics of welfare policies. The supply of vital public goods do not appear as an electorally salient issue. Our ostentatious nationalism looks away from the burning shame of the severe malnutrition of at least 1/3 of our children. Indian aspirations to be a great power will remain vacuous with its staggeringly backward education, particularly in terms of quality and the employability of students, and the dismal condition of its primary and public health and the nutrition of preschool children. More research is needed on political clientelism versus programmatic politics. I and Dilip Mukherjee have done some papers, both theoretical and empirical with respect to West Bengal micro-level data, but I think I would like to see similar studies in other states on this political clientelism versus programmatic politics, the political economy of it. Welfare policies that were introduced as citizens' rights in the first decade of this century, the right to education, work, food, information, etc., now converted into a welfare regime of gifts from the Prime Minister, often with his photograph attached, to a supplicant subject population. Does this mean the democratic discourse of citizens' rights is very fragile in India? Or alternatively speaking, what are the difficulties of organizing citizens, the potential beneficiaries around citizens' rights. Why is it so difficult? Why is it that first decade of this century started and then now it's all gifts from the Prime Minister? And talking of democracy, there's also a lot to work on public funding of elections. It is not that public funding of elections, we know about the United States is the other way, but a lot of European countries do public funding of elections. There are problems of doing that in India. I think one should even, nobody talks about public funding of elections in India anymore. I think it's worth exploring the advantages or disadvantages of public funding of elections in India. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Get all the panelists back up to the stage.
Acoustical balance, we're in order.
That's right.
He doesn't want your voice to be coming from over there.
That makes sense. Well, thank you so much to the panelists. Can we have another round of applause for this wonderful insights? We've just heard so much about the current status of India across these various disciplines, and a really clear clarion call from each one of the panelists around concrete ways in which we need more research in these areas to be able to answer the questions for what is going to enable India's success or divergence in the coming quarter century. So I want to open it up now to the audience to ask questions of the panelists. And what we're really looking forward to here is, in which ways are these topics intersectional? We've already heard from some of the panelists, and sort of the overlap is obvious in terms of the ways in which these areas of the economy and its study intersect. I want to just open it up for questions. I think if you just raise your hand, there will be a mic floating around somewhere, and we can hand you the mic as you take the questions. Wayne, you want to go ahead?
So I'll
and maybe a little introduction, just
Yes, do you want to? I'll just speak loudly. So I'll start with maybe a positive note. So my first visit to India was sponsored by the tech industry, where I saw Hyderabad, all of the tech centers. Emphasis was more spectacular than any campus in Silicon Valley. And so I came away with the impression, India is rocking it. And obviously we had the challenges of transportation, where, carts on the dirt roads and all the rest of it. But I have a very positive impression from that experience. And so I would just throw that out as an opener as we get to the next discussion.
Outstanding presentations. I'm glad I'm here today. So India is a really big country. And my experience is that regional issues are important. I wonder if you, if you might each address how the regional aspects of India come into play into your particular area.
Do we want to maybe, let's compile maybe 2-3 questions, and then we'll sort of take, yeah, go ahead. Over here behind, yes.
Thank you for this great discussion. It's probably the most illuminating discussion about India that I've heard in many years. I come from the real world. My name is Gunjan Bagla. I help US companies to do business in India. Two thoughts I wanted to bring up. One is a subject that you brought up, sir. You said it's patently obvious to anyone that India should be looked at carefully. But if you look at American media, other than the Wall Street Journal, they don't really talk much about India. Even today, I looked at the headlines on India. There's 2 absurd stories. One is from the BBC saying $400 billion spent by Modi to win this election, adding up all the public expenditures of the last 10 years. It makes no sense at all. There's a story about Bloomberg saying, my former employer, Larsen & Toubro, is losing orders because of the election. For 45 days, they won't get many orders. None of them make any sense to the real world. And my question for all of you is, what can we do in the US to make sure that Western media gives a fair shake to looking at India. If you look at CNN or any of the national channels, they'll talk about Stormy Daniels much more than what's happening in India, right? So that's one issue. Second question I have is we talked about how, and I think Dean Freund, you mentioned that India's companies don't have enough scale, right? And that's true. But on the other hand, we complain about Ambani and Adani and Tata getting all the power, right? So how is India to resolve that, right? Those are my two questions.
Not easy.
Let's take one more, and then we can pause to reflect on whatever chunk of that you want to bite off.
I think this question is probably most relevant for Pranab and Caroline, but perhaps others have ideas as well. But I'd love to hear the thoughts of the panelists on what role industrial policy should play in India's future. India is probably an interesting context in which to think about this question because industrial policy was very prominent in its first decades of independence with the heavy industrialization drive, state control of the economy in the first decades of independence. And as we all know, industrial policy has a bit of an intellectual and practical resurgence, recently, has had a resurgence recently. I'd love to hear the panelists' thoughts on whether industrial policy has a role in Indian economic policy going forward.
Great. Let's pause there and maybe whatever you'd like to respond to. You want to start, Pranab?
The question that was specifically addressed to me and Caroline, let me start with that, the industrial policy. I have been a support advocate of industrial policy for many decades. But I am also aware of the problems of industrial policy. And the usual problems people mention is picking winners. That doesn't bother me that much. Because when the private sector picks winners, the argument is that they pay the price if they make the wrong choice. But that price is paid by others as well. So if the government make mistakes, I think Danny Roderick, who's also a supporter of industrial policy, said somewhere that we don't really know what we are good at. So we'll make mistakes in finding out what we are good at. So in that, there will be, you will not pick winners always. It's part of the process of learning, discovering who we are, or what we are good at. But I do not support the current industrial policy, the PLI. Mm-hmm. One of the reasons why industrial policy worked reasonably well in East Asia, particularly Korea and Taiwan, was because they they measured the success and then adjusted the policy accordingly with export success. So if you have made the wrong choice, very soon that will show up whether you're succeeding in the export market or not. That's the criteria that South Korea has used, Taiwan has used, Japan before that has used. But India is not doing it. India is doing industrial policy under a relatively protectionist, as Caroline mentioned, a protectionist regime. It's a wrong way of doing it. And quite often, industrial policy, you have tariff in intermediate products as well as the final products, which is kind of self-defeating. And thirdly, jobs to me is the most important issue in India, politically explosive issue in India. These 14 or 17 sectors chosen by the PLI, most of them are capital intensive, not labor intensive. So I'm currently not in favor of the PLI, and so far they all themselves are aware they're not doing that well.
And the PLI being the performance-linked incentive, production-linked incentive, excuse me.
PLI is the production-linked incentives. Mobile phone, it has gone up. But other than that, the other sectors are not. Even in mobile phones, one is not sure how much value added is being created.
I just so much agree with what you just said. It was amazing. I think that is really the difference, is industrial policy that's driven by competitiveness measured in the global market, which shows that you're in an industry that you can compete in, versus one that are behind a wall for the domestic market. And they went so far in Korea as to measure it with literally the export lading bill. And the brilliant thing about that is you can't falsify it. So it was also protected from the kind of fraud. I want to mix that with the question about scale, because you think about industrial policy and you think about India, which you had a really nice point on your slides as well about India has all these billionaires and no big name brands. Maybe they have a couple, but I tend to agree. And what you see in countries that have done well is they actually do have billionaires. They're self-made billionaires. They're people who started companies that compete globally. So China actually has a lot of these self-made people who compete in global industries. Whereas India has a lot of these kind of inherited folks that aren't really competing that way, inherited in industries. But what you want is, so large enterprise is important, but you don't want the protected large enterprise, or we haven't talked about state-owned enterprises. What you want is the most productive firms to be able to grow large. So a business climate that allows the most productive firms to be able to grow large. And perhaps if industrial policy rewards those firms that are showing growth, that are meeting their export targets, then that would be okay. But for the most part, industrial policy gets captured. So there are many, many, many more examples of poor industrial policy that really doesn't work than there are of brilliant industrial policy. And even in East Asia, there's disagreement as to whether they would have grown faster in the absence, you can't really tell, of some of the industrial policy.
So I might pick up the business about regional, variation within the country. I mean, I think, Pranav sort of mentioned the South versus the North, and the in terms of the business environment, and even, basics about delivery of human capital and so forth, does vary a lot state by state. And I think one of the concerns is when you have this massive growth in the federal sector, one loses some of that possibility to look at states that are successful, that are able to successfully transition. And I think some of that's happening. Most of that's the urban sector. From the rural perspective, which is mostly where I look, I think there's a lot more similarity across different states in terms of just what it's like to be a subsistent farmer who's not well integrated into a sort of a world economy. But in the urban sector, it's no question that different states have taken different positions, and in terms of and that there is substantial differences across states that can be useful, partly on the experimentation point, as Bernard pointed out.
I just wanted to add a couple points. I mean, on the industrial policy, I think one basic thing that Danny and Reka, Juhas, and others have been starting to work on is this idea that we don't actually know across countries, particularly in low-income countries, what industrial policy can we actually even just have a record of industrial policies and what they look like, because it's obviously very complex, and these sectors are linked, and the policies themselves are sort of buried in legislation and other kind of government documents. So just unearthing what exactly industrial policy looks like, which sectors have been emphasized, to what extent, what form do the policies take. Just cataloging that, I think, is of a primary interest, and in particular, that's true within India as well. So I think that's something that can be taken up as research. And I'll say, just a plug for our special lecture later this afternoon. That I actually think, that states do serve, or regional, entities do serve as still as laboratories of experimentation and progress. In India, and Karthik Muralidharan is going to be talking about his work, and which has largely focused on kind of making states more effective. So we'll hear more about that later this afternoon. Let's turn it over for other questions.
I just want to say one more thing about the regions, that the GST was huge in India, because it used to be the case almost that India was like a country of countries that had borders, and you got rid of those borders.
And just so all questions are answered, you know, my first research trip was to collect data at Emphasis, and you know, that's the bright spot, right? That's if everything that's so regionally focused. It's also the example where it's you know, Narayana Murthy is not someone who inherited his wealth. It's just it hasn't created the job growth that's lifted everybody, and it's created wealth in the South, but you know, not in the North. So if that success story could be replicated everywhere, you know, well, more of us besides Emily would have been positive. And in terms of news on India, I don't know that India is worse than anything else. You know, I guess you could just say that you should just commiserate with the people who wish there's more on China or more on Brazil. You know,
I might add something to that. Many years back, when I was a student, the first time I went from India to Britain, that's where I first went to Cambridge, England, I used to find my other Indian students, they are all complaining, here the newspapers carry no news about India. I remember telling one of them, no news is good news. Because they will carry news of India when huge natural disaster or a huge man-made disaster. Thousands of people are dead, and so on. So I said, if there's no news, I'm happy.
Yes, I was recently in India, spent about a month, and traveled toward the northeast. And a couple of observations. This was after about 10 years ago I was there. One, the infrastructure that is being developed there as in place is just tremendous. And it goes from north to south, east to west. And you see so much construction going on. Still, it's not done. The roads are in such amazing shape now that you could go to places where you used to take all day to go to Haridwar from Delhi. You can get there in 3 hours. So that's a subject I haven't seen brought up here. That's one observation. The second observation is towards Dr. Seema here. My sister is a gynecologist in the middle of Haryana. I'm from Haryana, in a little town that's surrounded by villages. And there's no abortion anymore. As far as the selective abortion is criminal, so she used to do those in the past. So I think much has changed on that. You know, the selection of the sex that was there for a while, but today, you know, it's banned nationally, and it's really fearful on the doctor's side. So they don't listen to even payments people make, no. So a couple of those observations, and huge debate on the north and south. I think that was brought already here as to how do you combine and make it one government or one national, if you would, economic and political enterprise than what we have today. So those are a couple of my comments, really.
Yeah, Raphael.
So what we've heard is a lot about size, scale. Biggest population in the world, third largest economy, a lot of engineers, more graduates than any place else, et cetera, huge numbers. And yet we've heard a lot about, you can call it structural, you can call it endemic, deficiencies, trade deficiencies, gender inequality, over-centralized government, educational backwardness, et cetera, et cetera. So size alone is not going to solve those issues, obviously. So my question to you all is, what is it that gives you optimism about India? Is it something in their culture, in their polity, in their governmental structure? What is it that should give people the sense that despite all these problems, it's going to meet its potential?
You should have prefaced this by saying economists are naturally pessimists. I think. So, you know.
It's a dismal science up here.
Hi, my name's John Lehman. I and a couple friends here are students of Professor Murali Dharan's great Econ 164 class as undergrads. I'm from Indonesia, Jakarta, Indonesia. And we just had our elections, as many of you might know. It's always when Indonesia has their election, next year, India too. And a trend that is very obvious and visible around the world and in Indonesia is, especially as a Chinese Indonesian, you get a lot of uncles and aunties, oms and tantes, who are looking at China and they say, well, the authoritarian countries, they don't seem so bad. I mean, they seem to be doing so good. And they're not economists or experts in political theory, but they see what they see. And so I have an open-ended question, kind of, but at least from a more, where the U.S. is a very democratically rooted country, to this panel, what do you think is going to be the general trend of all these, developing nations clamoring for basically a Lee Kuan Yew? Please lead our country the way that he did, And this is really open-ended, right? Because I think that this has a lot of implications for trade policy, for industrialization, for structural change, of course, this is a political economy question, and for women, especially in Indonesia being an Islamic country and a very racially and ethnically diverse country. Thank you.
Okay, let's pause there and take some responses.
Yeah, I know that your professor wanted you to ask a question that's good. Now we're going to give him politic answers. I think maybe, I think there's great roads and lots of electrification, and I think when a leader delivers that blocking and tackling, it gives them a lot of free rein to do things. You would love a benevolent dictator, but I'm worried about India, and I think. So similar to Indonesia. So I guess we can all just be optimistic. I'm optimistic just because I don't want to think otherwise about what might happen. But yeah, I do think competence, we want competence per se, and it gets really scary when competence becomes a foot in the door to sort of erode democracy. And and so then on the gender question about sex selection, the most recent data I've seen is through 2020, and there's no change in the skewed sex ratio through 2020. Maybe it's changed since then. I'm pretty skeptical of that, and I hope we have legitimate data later to be able to actually see if the trends changed.
Yeah.
I want to go back to the issue of the authoritarianism, China, etc. Lee Kuan Yew, Singapore. I have actually I have a book on China and India where I go on this question quite a bit. It's called Awakening Giants, Feet of Clay. It's China and India, the giants. You see, Chinese system has a lot of good things about it. And I have discussed what are the good things about Chinese governance, which other countries can learn. And I mentioned several, but let me mention two now. One is decentralization. Chinese system is much more decentralized. Even though it's an autocracy, it's much more decentralized than India. One simple figure that is now widely quoted, but I quoted in my book 10 years back, is that if you look at sub-provincial, below the state government level, total government expenditure that is spent in China is about 55%. What's the percentage in India? 3%. So that tells you the huge difference. China is an autocracy, India is a democracy, but India does not have local democracy in that respect. Doesn't take the local government so seriously. So that is one good aspect of Chinese governance. Second example that I'm going to give you is that Chinese bureaucracy, the way they are promoted, depends on their local performance. Mm-hmm. If you perform well, then you get promoted. If you perform well locally, you get promoted. In India, most of the promotion is seniority-based, not performance-based, and certainly not local performance-based. Having said that, let me immediately say, these two aspects, I could mention other examples, have nothing to do with authoritarianism. There is no reason why a democratic country cannot have both of these. So authoritarianism is neither necessary nor sufficient for these good aspects of Chinese governance. On the other hand, the ugly aspects of Chinese governance, extreme repression, extreme authoritarianism, that is entirely due to authoritarianism. So authoritarianism is both necessary and sufficient for that. So we should think about in those lines, what are the good aspects, what are the bad aspects, is that replicable or not? The other thing about Lee Kuan Yew, he's like the good Chinese emperor. But what I don't like about Lee Kuan Yew is it's a patrimonial, it's a benevolent dictator as Seema talked about. The good emperor knows what is good for you. I don't like that system. That infantilizes you. You are a subject population, the good emperor has done good things for you. That is not development in my judgment. When somebody else chooses things for you, even if it's good, is not good development. Amartya Sen has a book called Development as Freedom. And that one of the main points is this, is that we should define development which includes autonomy. And here, a good emperor decides what is good for you is not part of development, if you take Amartya Sen's definition.
Can I push you on that a little bit? Because I guess, that's the first best. But, I think the question is that people might prefer the competent dictator to the messy democracy. And so, kind of what's going to stop us from, how do we get out of that
My question is, how do you ensure that a good emperor remains good? Because when the good emperor does badly, nobody can because everybody's afraid. And secondly, even the good emperor, if that good emperor is a human, bound to make mistakes. And nobody will tell them that they are making mistakes. So, and China is a good example of it, that when the emperor makes mistakes, it takes too long to correct. Because even to detect the mistake, it takes a long time. Because nobody around the emperor tells them that they are making mistakes.
So you're making an argument why people, voters will make a mistake if that's the path they choose. But I think the question is, it seems what people want. How do you convince the voters in India or the voters in Indonesia of that?
Is how do you ensure, first of all, that all emperors will be good? Second, even if you ensure some way that you have got a good emperor, how do you ensure the good emperor will remain good? And thirdly, there is an institutional way of saying that you cannot correct, the emperor cannot correct mistakes so easily. And the cost of correction of mistakes institutionally is very high.
Maybe to put in a different way is, if you look across countries that are democratic and autocratic, you can see the correlation with growth. And there's lots of studies that look at the effect of democracy, different levels using the polity data on growth. And really the correlation's not very high. What is clear is that autocracies have a wider variance in outcomes. So you can have some super good outcomes, you're a benevolent dictator, but you also get the really bad outcomes with bad growth and you're suffering under a dictator. So I think people look to China and then think that it's because they're an autocracy that they're growing, but the evidence doesn't necessarily support that means because you grow. They also have this system of competing regions, meritocracy. I mean, a few things came together along with very actually Washington consensus-like reforms from 2000 on that led to growth. And now they're reversing that and not clear they'll continue to grow.
So I wanted to say something about about what gives me optimism, and certainly part of it is what life, the people who make it through the day. But I think there's another element which is maybe relevant in this audience was the quality of people from India who are not there. Now, that's a funny thing to say, but first it resonates with the fact that there are some real strengths in terms of the production of human capital in India at the very top level. That's something to be said. It also says, and I know many, many friends who would love to go back to India but feel unable to because of the current political climate. So despite the many positive aspects of delivering services and competence, as we've talked about, the sort of weakness of political liberties is a real cost. But the flip side of that, if that would break, there are many people who would be willing to invest back into India as people and with their resources. And that's not something that every country in the world can count on.
And I guess I just have one other thought. I totally agree. Like the things that give me the most optimism are when I meet people like coming up with really innovative solutions who are using their human capital and international work experience to really tackle some of these social problems. I think that's just the most exciting thing to see. And I agree, if people don't go back, that's a big problem. And I guess on all of this digitization and efficiency and centralization of information, I do think that the flip side of it is now everybody's visible, and it's there's a very everything is, and all of your information, all of your benefits are very, very centralized. And so I do think that does have political risks.
And I will just add on the political front, there is not at the federal level, but at the state level and local levels, quite a lot of electoral turnover and close elections, many of which have been exploited for, identification gain in this room. And I think that that speaks to the idea that at least at local and state levels. There is political competition that's meaningful and substantial. So whether, of course, that translates to the national level is a different story. But it shows that at least the electorate does have a voice and frequently makes changes if they feel like their government isn't providing. Okay, so we have a couple more minutes. Let's take the two questions back there, and then this one here. Go ahead.
I'm a chemistry professor here, and this is the first time I'm hearing economics talk.
Maybe the last.
And you're still here.
I'm still here. I'm listening. I actually enjoyed your talk. I see it because I go to India all the time, 3 times a year. I spend a lot of time in India. So I think one thing I didn't hear from you, so if I understand you correctly, that you're saying it's really India government make the policies. So those are bad policies, one thing. And one thing you haven't said, corruption. I didn't hear it. So I know all about it, right? Whether you're 6,000 rupees to the farmers, because I come from a farming family, and I know corruption because I also come from a business family. So in India, you cannot really do any business without sort of taking a route that is not fair or honest. So my question to you, is it really what I'm thinking? Is that what you're trying to say, but you haven't really said it explicitly? That's a huge problem in India. Maybe in other countries, all the countries there are suffering. Is it what I get? I know you're talking about the election, authoritarianism, and all of those things, but it comes down to the policies, right? That's what we're talking about, the difference between China and India, and corruption. So is that something that you can really discuss or something?
Thanks. In the back.
So a lot of the discussion has been about how unequal India is today. But when India reached its independence, that was the party that was in control for the first big part of Indian history was a socialist party that was really committed to reducing the dramatic inequalities that existed in India. And I'm curious the panel's take on what happened. Like, why wasn't this successful at leading to a society that looks closer to a social democracy today, and instead looks more like a society like a South Africa or Brazil in terms of inequality? So, was it just a failure to fully implement the socialist policies, right, from the 1950s to the 1970s, or sort of what has brought India to this very unequal place in the present day?
Thanks. Let's take one more. Let's do over here, sorry, just because you had raised your hand first. Apologies.
Thank you again. We have a lot of interesting questions that we want to answer, but I feel that India lacks in terms of availability of publicly available nationally representative data. And what do the panelists think about, has this been historically the case? Or what are the barriers to which we think on certain reasons why we don't have the data that we require as researchers available to us?
Thanks. All right. So in no particular order, comments on that?
I'll just comment on the corruption one. A lot of countries are corrupt. Most of countries are corrupt. And I think corruption is the policies that cause India to grow slowly. Some of them also are supporting corruption, but you can grow quickly and be corrupt. Korea definitely did that with their chai bowls and whatnot. So I think it's much more about whether the incentives of the economic actors are to do more productive activities and things that are traded globally and things like that. If the incentives are so bad that you put most of your effort into corrupt activities that aren't even productive. So you can have productive corrupt activities and unproductive corrupt activities. As long as you're doing the productive ones, it's kind of okay. So the regulation in India, does create, like there's this famous study, I won't go into the details, around, getting a driver's license in India and it not, the person you have to hire to get the license for you means you never learn to drive, so the drivers are worse, the process worse, there's corruption, all this. But you can grow with corruption as long as the incentives are in the right place. So India just really needs to get the incentives in the right place towards productive activity, allowing firms that are productive to grow and to grow big and to trade and so forth.
So I'll take on Steve's question a bit. I think my first thought was a lot of the blame may lie with the field of development economics. What we know now is not what we knew when I started 30 years ago, and certainly not what we knew when Pranav started some decade before that. We've learned a lot about how countries develop, and I think to some extent it's right that there was an understanding about the importance of welfare and delivery of services, but not understanding of, first of all, what a good industrial policy might look like the protectionism that was in place had huge consequences, I think, for many, many years. And opening up, I think, showed evidence that maybe that wasn't the right idea. But it wasn't necessarily their fault. It's like, that's what we told them, right? We as a profession. So I think there's an element of that. I think, the focus on delivery from the center was central to Congress, as opposed to thinking things more from the bottom up of how do you build entrepreneurship from the bottom up. I think, again, that's not something that was sort of part of that model. And I think now we understand things quite differently, and we've seen the successes of Vietnam's and so forth, and we understand a little bit better about what might have been done. But in some sense, we wouldn't have expected them to know that in the time when they took over the government at independence.
But I think his question was about inequality.
Well, yes, but
you can't blame development economics for inequality.
Well, but growth and equality, they go together as well, in part.
I have a feeling that first of all, they were not socialists. They were social democrats.
Yeah.
But they did not even social democracy requires some fundamental changes in ownership patterns, control of means of production, etc. They didn't do any of this. Even land reform.
Yeah.
There are many other issues one can go into. So yes, there are a lot of rhetoric of socialist rhetoric. But the reason why inequality did not change, or if anything grew, is because of the ground realities of politics, political inequality, and also ownership inequalities were different. So even the best development economists could not do anything.
I was going to say, that
you are
puts a lot of
blaming
power in
development
our
economics.
hands, Andrew.
You're blaming development economics too much for this.
Let me suggest that we continue this discussion over coffee and treats, and then we'll reconvene in about 15 minutes or so to have our keynote and the special lecture session. All right, so thank you so much to the panelists. This was a wonderful discussion. All right, well, I hope everyone is buzzing with ideas from the wonderful panel discussion we just had and also from the coffee. That was my dad joke of the day. It's now time to begin our second session. It's my privilege to introduce our keynote speaker, Michael Kremer. Michael is the university professor in the Kenneth C. Griffin Department of Economics at the University of Chicago and the co-recipient of the 2019 Nobel Prize in Economics. Michael embodies the very best in our profession. He is a leader in our field who has shaped in a really fundamental way our understanding of the processes of development and how public policy can best be leveraged to effectively improve economic growth and well-being in low-income countries. He's also a visionary leader in development policymaking. He has been instrumental in creating a number of incredibly important institutions that have completely changed the culture around the importance of impact evaluation and rigor for development practitioners around the world. Initiatives that he has championed, such as advanced market commitments for vaccines and Deworm the World, have profoundly impacted the lives of millions and millions of people, including deep, deep impacts in India. And finally, on a personal note, I look up to Michael as a role model for his persistent humility and unpretentiousness, in spite of widespread recognition for his contributions at the very highest levels. So thank you, Michael, not only for being here with us today and sharing your thoughts, but also for all that you do for the profession and for the practice of development worldwide. Let's all please welcome Professor Michael Kremer.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that extremely, extremely kind introduction. So I wanted to begin with, oops, let me try and hide that slide. I wanted to start out by going back to the question that Ach raised at the beginning, which was the question of what type of research can best drive informed policymaking and have the most impact. And we heard amazing presentations in the last round about structural transformation, trade, finance, gender, political economy. So I'm here to announce the winner. No, I will take a cue from Kartik's book on this, and avoid the politically difficult of left versus right or picking among these things, but instead actually more deeply follow Kartik's book in thinking about the structures of the Indian state and how that intersects with how research can inform policy. So as Kartik's wonderful book points out, and is probably the main emphasis of the book, is some of the weaknesses of the Indian state. Trust deficits that limit the state's ability to negotiate policy changes with stakeholders, elite exit from many of the institutions of the state. That means there's not necessarily such strong pressure to improve outcomes within the state. A bureaucracy that's held accountable on process instead of outcomes. Over-centralization, which came up in the discussion as well. So a natural conclusion from this would be that India would be, far from the best and perhaps a particularly difficult place for researchers who hope to contribute to policy or to work on evidence-based policy and policy innovation. So I thought I'd try to think about this, and I thought I'd try to bring evidence that is very handy. I didn't try to go out and do new empirical work for this, but I did think about what evidence do I have. So one of the I've been involved in Development Innovation Ventures, which is a unit of the U.S. government, part of USAID, which supports evidence-based innovation, including policy innovation. And it's not a surprise, given the number of strong Indian development economists, the number of Indian origin and Indian connected innovators and entrepreneurs, that we got a lot of applications that look pretty strong from India, and we funded a lot of those. And in fact, we had some sort of review done of what we were doing, and one of the criticisms in the review was that a lot of the funding went to India. I believe the particular criticism, I didn't look back and check this, but I believe the particular criticism was that 40% of the funding went to India, or of the funded proposals were from India and Kenya. Now, I thought maybe India and Kenya account for 40% of the eligible population, given that USAID doesn't support work in China. So I thought about various, at the time I thought about various reasons why that criticism, like all criticisms, was totally illegitimate. But I haven't forgotten. So I decided I would, in thinking about this talk, I thought, well, let's do a classic test that economists do. And let's look at, so a classic test that economists use for, is there bias or favoritism in a process, is if there is that bias, then when you look at the outcomes, you might see that the group that is where there's bias towards them are performing poorly relative to the amount of resources that went there, and vice versa. So, so let me show you that test for India. And obviously, this is just one program, but or one funding program. So overall, we analyzed the portfolio, and this is from another paper that I wrote. I've just added arrows for the projects in India. 41 programs, or 43 separate grants. And you can see the ones that are, and this is the distribution of number of people reached. As you can see, it's very skewed. And this is there's some arbitrariness that goes into something like this. The ones, but you'll notice that the top three I've labeled everything that reached more than 1 million people. The top three are all from India. And overall, there are four of them out of 9. So India is actually performing pretty well, or in terms of does research and innovation scale there. If you look at the count, I wouldn't say it's performing extraordinarily well, because a lot of the grants went to India. But if you look at the total number of people reached, this is all. This distribution is very skewed. There's a discontinuity in the scale there. So software for community health workers had by far the largest reach. So overall, of the 100 million people reached, let me check if I'm missing the. Let me see if I've got the number here. I believe it was 75% of the people reached were reached in India. So looks like funding, if you're a research funder or an innovation funder, looks like funding India may make a lot of sense. Obviously, a lot of that's because India is big, and so there's a lot of opportunity to scale. If you look at the counts, it's not nearly as disproportionate. But if you're in, it depends what objective function you're maximizing if you're the innovation funder. But if you're judging by total benefits, and I can't say anything about how the magnitude of benefits of these compare to each other right now. But if you're thinking about total benefits, then total scale matters a lot. I don't think the programs in India were particularly costly because we're funding the innovation, not the scale up. Okay. How do we reconcile this with the fairly negative, and some of these, not all of them, but were things related to the state. Most notably, the program that scaled the most, software for community health workers. This is software that the Indian government adopted and used for its community health workers, and was shown to generate in an RCT some improved health outcomes. Why this? How do we reconcile this with the insights in the book? Well, Karthik's book also points out some strengths of the Indian state, like a strong senior civil service, which has some people who are, attracts very able people, and some of whom are very committed, and also points out the ability of the Indian state to make progress when in mission mode. I'll go through some examples not from this source, but elsewhere, and argue those contributed. But the book also suggests some potential, if you think about the weaknesses the book identifies, it also suggests some potential workarounds around those. So I'll talk about some innovations that I was involved in, or evidence-based policy, things I was involved in. I'll talk about the response of the Indian state on those, and I'll try to think about it through the lens of Karthik's book. Okay. Obviously, this is not at all a scientific sample. Okay. So, and I'll do the rest without slides. Gosh. Sorry, I've just, sorry. Okay. Okay, so let me go through a few different examples, and then sure, I'll start with just a brief, for those of you who are not familiar with the issue, I'll talk a little bit about the evidence on each of those. And then I'll talk about the response of the Indian state in each of these cases. In particular, I'll talk about deworming, clean water, weather forecasts for agriculture, and then I'll talk about some issues in education where there was less progress, I'd argue. And think about lessons for researchers, not about which sector to work in, but about when there might be opportunities in a particular sector for research to have an impact. I obviously wasn't thinking about these at the time, but after reading the book, I realized there's certain patterns there. So let me start with the example of school-based deworming, which Aj mentioned. So background on this, 1 out of every 5 people globally are infected with intestinal helminths. And there's medication for this, which is very safe, very expensive, very inexpensive. But the diagnosis is expensive and logistically complicated. So the World Health Organization recommends that it particularly affects school children. So the World Health Organization recommends that school children in endemic areas with more than 20% prevalence receive deworming medicine regularly, so through school-based mass deworming program. I was involved in a study with Ted Miguel, which took advantage of quasi-random order of the rollout of this, of a program with 75 schools on phase-in of school-based deworming. We found a big reduction in student absence, benefits in terms of reduction in disease spread led to similar benefits nearby. increased proportion of girls who finish primary school and enter secondary school, and in more recent results, we've seen increased earnings later in life, and some non-agricultural work, although I don't know whether that counts as structural transformation right now. So the medicine was already shown to be effective, but this was a program that, of all the problems in Kenya, or for that matter in India, worms are not, they don't kill you. And this was not necessarily top of the agenda for the Ministry of Health. And this was school-based deworming. That doesn't happen through the Ministry of Health. That happens through the Ministry of Education. So this is true, I think, in many governments, not at all just in India, but getting cooperation across ministries is very difficult. So I think that research, I feel I just got credit for it 5 minutes ago, but we knew the medicine worked already and killed the worms. This was so why did this research have an impact? Well, one of the reasons it had an impact is it showed an educational gains, which was important to convince the relevant ministry, the Ministry of Education, that it was worth adopting this. And that turned out that was certainly the case in Kenya. And so Kenya scaled this up with some assistance from the World Bank. And a key factor here, in addition to the World Bank, was World Health Organization. Why? Because this is an area that the health ministry might say, hey, you can't go be administering medicine without the health personnel running the show. Teachers don't have qualifications to do that. World Health Organization developed a protocol for this that involved, and they blessed teachers doing this with training from the health ministry. Okay? So after this was done in Kenya, World Bank officials talked to Indian state governments. And Indian state governments decided to adopt this. And again, I think it was the same sort of getting cross-ministerial committees that bring different sectors of the bureaucracy together. So this is not so much a focus of the book, but one lesson I would draw is, moving across, taking innovations across borders is pretty difficult. And that's why a lot of the innovations that were developed in India were the ones that scaled the most. I think the international organizations, there's a lot of political debates about them and so on, but I think on a lot of technical issues that aren't super political, they can play an important role by, the World Health Organization plays this role of, they're seen as neutral guidance, technical guidance, and the World Bank perhaps less purely technical, but still there are people in ministries who trust them. Even in India, a place where there's some suspicion about the bank, and certainly not they're not nearly as financially important as they are in much of Africa. But in any case, the Bihar government began a state deworming program in 2011. And again, part of the discussion in the book is about federalism. And there's a point made, I think very accurately, about the weaknesses and the extreme centralization in India. But simply having that federal structure means that state governments, particularly Bihar, my understanding at the time, had a particularly capable government, a particularly reformist government. And that meant that they were able to try something, and that when people saw that was working, other state governments started adopting, and then eventually the national government adopted this, and Modi adopted this and made it a national program. So through a national deworming day, Rashtriya Krimi Mukti Abhiyan. I'm probably pronouncing that terribly. I don't know if I was much more involved in the Kenya program than the India program. But this now covers basically all the parts of India that have substantial worm burdens. Now this was a couple of things to note about this. One, this was very much mission. don't know whether it was technically a mission, but it was very much a mission mode operation. This is a national deworming day. Lots of resources of the whole state go to this one objective on that one day. So that's a point that's emphasized in the book. That what can be done with this mission mode? Is that necessarily the most effective way of doing things? That's another question, but it did get done. One other thing I would note is there was technical evidence for this support. And here I'm also speculating a bit, but my sense is there was a certain match with the political impulses, the emphasis on cleanliness and so on that the current government has. Okay, but one of the points of the book is the great weakness of the civil service below this top level. Very, very competent people at the very top, but things get much weaker lower down. And so how do you actually implement? And will anything, did the program actually happen? Recently saw some results on worm loads in these Indian states. And remember, they had to be above 20% for the program to be put in place in the first place. Well, there's just dramatic reductions in worm loads in these states. These are not, you can't, if this were an academic seminar, I'd have to say we don't know for sure that it was the program that did that. It could be general economic development in India. I'm sure that played a role as well. But the reductions were so dramatic over a relatively brief period, it seems likely that the treatment had an impact. Now, one of the aspects of this was one of the themes in the book is that there can be gains from cooperation between the state and non-state actors. Well, this was a case where there was a particular non-state actor that was involved. It was in an organization called Evidence Action. Deworm the World sort of folded its operations into Evidence Action, and they have a very extensive state-level network that goes down to, I don't know whether it goes down, whether it's exactly the district, but they have a large number of people involved at quite decentralized levels to help with data collection, a theme of the book, and with just implementation. Okay. And of course, they feed back that information to people at the senior level, and they're able to they have the connections at the senior level. Now, this NGO, where did they get their support? Well, they got this support from funders who are very quantitative and very likely, unlike many funders, to say, well, we're going to multiply the benefits times the number of people reached. And I think that orientation, there are only a certain number of funders like that, but for a funder like that, I think that type of decision makes a lot of sense. Working with the Indian state is a way to generate huge amounts of impact. Okay, let me mention another example. This is work that's going on right now, so we'll wait to see exactly how this turns out. But this is on water treatment and water chlorination. So let me give a bit of background on this, and then I'll say a little bit of the evidence. So the background is there's, diarrhea is a very big killer of children under 5. There's one of the causes of diarrhea is contaminated water. There's in India, and there's the water, even in urban areas, the water is delivered intermittently. So you get a couple of hours supply, or maybe a couple of hours supply in the morning and a couple of hours at night. That means there's negative pressure in the pipes. When there's negative pressure, if there's leaks in New York, water comes out of the pipes. If there's leaks in India, water goes into the pipes. And that's likely to be contaminated water. So it gets very dirty, even in a pipe system. And this is not unique to India. Many lower middle income countries have this as well. Okay? So, and perhaps the problem is exacerbated in India because as the book points out, people with high income have exited public provision. So they all have their own filters at home, they have their own storage capacity, et cetera, so they don't have to rely entirely on the public system. And that presumably reduces public support for, reduces pressure for getting the water clean. Poor people probably have other priorities. Those priorities include, however, getting access to water. That's something that people around the world seem to value very highly. Well, revenue's now coming into the Indian government. And as the book notes, India is a democracy, and there's been some discussion of that. And one of the features of, if you want to be successful in a democracy, one way to do that, at least in some circumstances, is to deliver tangible benefits to the population. And of course, Kartik's book points out that that's one of the things, or at least that's one of the things that this government is doing. It's delivering things to the population. That's one of the reasons why it's getting reelected. And so one of those campaign promises was to connect every rural household to piped water. That's a $40 billion program. So it's a huge program, and there's been lots of progress in doing that. Well, if you combine that with other aspects of India, and in particular the very strong senior people in the civil service, when you have a $40 billion program, you assign some very good civil servants to run this program. So the top person in Jal Jeevan Mission, Vinay Mahajan, is very well known as a very, very strong senior civil servant. But in fact, there's a whole layer of leadership just underneath her, which is also very strong. And so let me say a little bit about the evidence side. And I'll say more about that. If you show up, I've got to advertise my talk tomorrow, I think. I'll talk about some of the evidence on water treatment. But basically, was involved in a meta-analysis, and we found that treating water, which is very inexpensive, averts 1 out of every 4 cases of child mortality. So in this context, this then becomes extremely cost-effective as a health intervention because chlorine's very cheap. So we shared this evidence with the leadership of Jal Jeevan Mission. They were very quick to appreciate the evidence and understand it, to think about what could be done about it, and they immediately started efforts to try piloting a number of approaches around something called inline chlorination, which is basically attaching an inexpensive device to a pipe that can be done, doesn't require electricity, can be done even in single village systems. It's not a whole treatment plant. They made what in some ways is a pretty amazing decision. There are lots of interest groups. There's problems of arsenic, there's problems of fluorides in the water, all sorts of problems. These are real problems. I don't want to pretend they're not, but they realize this is something that can be done at the big killer is microbiological contamination, and they said we're going to move ahead with that, and we'll also try and address the other things rather than waiting and being paralyzed until everything could be done at once. So they've announced national guidelines to try to implement this. Now, this is something that's going to require a lot of detail in the implementation. You have to install these differently in different places. You have to resupply them. I think, we'll see how all that works. But one positive sign is, again, there's very close cooperation with a group that's gotten funding from donors who are interested in who are very motivated by the scale of the potential population reached. And they're going to be working on this in 2 states to start out with 40 million people. And I'm reasonably optimistic that that they'll be able to work out some of the issues there and that this will help out with other states. Okay. Let me note, though, just how deeply entrenched pick up on another point that that Kartik mentioned, which I should have mentioned earlier, which is the issue of, why is it so hard to make progress on issues? I think this was in large part a case of luck, of being in the right place at the right time when these particularly good civil servants were in charge, or particularly evidence-oriented civil servants were in charge. Well, one of the several things. First, one of the risks, as the book points out, is civil servants are transferred all the time. So there's a hope that this will stay in mission mode and we'll still have good civil servants, but that's one risk. But why is it so hard? Why is there not more political support for it? Well, it's not only that the well-off have exited the public water supply, but there's no trust. And let me just illustrate. So there's one of all, I hope I'm not offending anybody by this, but of all places, Orissa has an incredibly strong urban water supply with truly 24/7 access and drink from tap quality water. And they've actually become a model and are being heavily promoted. I visited some of these places, and we talked to the middle-class customers. I don't want to say none of them. Very, very few of them have given up on their private infrastructure. They're still using their filters. They're still investing money in new equipment. The idea of not using their own, even to highly educated people who they're not going to trust the public water supply, even though this has been in place for years. So it's that lack of trust is also one of the reasons, I think, why it's hard to make progress on this. Okay, but nonetheless, looks like a lot's likely to happen on this. And we estimate that if this actually got scaled up nationwide, it would save 135,000 child lives per year. That's with our straight meta-analysis estimate. You could make that lower if you came in with less optimistic priors. Okay, let me pick up on another theme from the book, which is, if you look at the guidelines, I think one of the risks is the government's trying, or the JJM is trying to fix the problem of over-centralization. So it calls for all of these things to be administered at the panchayat level. The ongoing maintenance and resupply of the chlorine, et cetera. Now, in this case, I'm attached to clean water. As somebody who's attached to clean water, do I feel better about this being run by the local government? Or do I feel better with it being run by the state governments and JJM? Well, clearly, and there are some technical reasons for this about what's the efficient scale to run maintenance operations. I think there's an argument for doing this at the district or state level where you can issue a contract for lots of places. But if you think about one of the reasons why centralization is so, things get stuck on centralization is when somebody comes in who cares about a particular issue, whether it's water or something else, if they want to get something done on that, there's a temptation to work in a very centralized way and to set things up in a continued way for that. And I think that is one of the issues that any effort at decentralization is going to have to take on, because even if this would be better in the long run, it may be worse in the short run. So thinking about how you sequence decentralization and thinking very hard about what gets decentralized, I think, is very important. Okay. Okay, let me mention a third area. And this is on agriculture and climate change and weather. So climate change is obviously making it harder for farmers to predict predict the weather and therefore to plan their agricultural operations. There's a number of, in terms of the evidence, there's a number of very nice papers by economists on weather forecasting. Many of you will be familiar with Rosenzweig and Udry's paper showing that in the areas where India Meteorological Department forecasts are good, farmers react to those and change their behavior. Where the forecasts aren't so good, they ignore them. And they estimate very large gains from this, that if you could raise the quality to the current accuracy of forecasts, you'd get a $660 million gain. And you could adjust that upwards for lots of reasons. And then there's a more recent paper in Telangana. So there have been big advances in weather forecasting. So some of this, just using traditional physics-based methods, you can predict monsoon onset much better now. And this is not done at the state level by the IMD. The IMD just says the forecast is going to hit, the monsoon's going to hit Kerala at a certain date. That's where it hits first. Okay. Now, one of the problems, why are they not, there's a discussion of accountability and lack of accountability. But people are very afraid, again, it's not easy to solve this problem. People are very afraid of accountability. If the IMD starts issuing those forecasts and those forecasts are wrong, they're going to get in trouble. And they can say whatever they want about the error bounds on that forecast and the confidence levels, but they're concerned about it. So the IMD is very conservative about this. Well, again, senior people in the Ministry of Agriculture have actually been very, I think very progressive and willing to take risks. They're going to, based in part on the evidence from the Telangana work by my colleagues Amir Jina and Fiona Burlig and Aaron Calais and a graduate student named Harshal Sahai and Greg Lane. There's evidence that delivering forecasts to farmers leads them to change their behavior. And the national government's going to scale that up in Telangana. They're going to start sending IMD forecasts in certain districts. Fingers crossed, in a few days, people will get monsoon onset forecasts. Okay, and of course the government has 100 million telephone numbers. So I hope this will expand. Of 100 million farmer telephone numbers. Hope this will expand over time. What is this doing if we think about the larger thing of supplying agricultural information to farmers? Well, government of India does not a very good job of supplying agricultural information to farmers. If you look at trust in information from extension agents, it's extremely low. Where do people get their information from? It's not from extension agents. Well, what this approach is doing in a way is it's just substituting technology as a way to get the central government, central authorities can go straight to the citizen. Again, this may be a workaround, and it can be I think in this case, it's a totally appropriate way to go. And digital agriculture in general has a lot of promise. But this in some other ways can be seen as bypassing the fundamental problems in agricultural extension services that are characteristic of the Indian state. Okay, let me just let me close with some examples from education, which I think illustrate that despite these examples that either have been successful or look like they're being very successful, and I think do indicate that it makes sense to do research on India if you're interested in policy impact, and even to invest in research in India if you're interested in policy impact, and can get tremendous returns from doing so. That doesn't change the fundamental problems in the Indian state that the book identifies. And I think that's illustrated by the case of education. So Kartik and I worked with Kartik on the survey of absence of Indian school teachers. And that was how many years ago now? Yeah. Well, that problem is not getting better. The data has been out there. It's gotten attention, and it's not getting better. There's fundamental political economy, structural reasons. Maybe it will, and maybe there's some technical tricks, but it's a very difficult problem. And when politicians try and crack down on teachers, they don't necessarily. It doesn't necessarily turn out to be a winning strategy for them. If you think, there's been efforts with technology, and Kartik's demonstrated some amazing results in his research, and some, success even in working with governments. But that requires a lot of input from beyond the state, and maybe that just needs to be there and be part of this on the long term. Maybe there will be ways to bring it down. I'm interested to hear your take. Maybe you're more optimistic than that. But I was involved in looking at Indian ed tech program recently in another state, and two things. First, the teachers weren't using it. They were supposed to be getting, I believe, 2 40-minute sessions per week. The usage when we looked at it, and this was early, but this was well into the school year. Half the school year was gone. 40 minutes usage on average as logged by the system. And the central government then turned its state government then turned its attention to the problem and fixed it. But they can't do that for every problem, or at least they made substantial progress on it. But more fundamentally, the students were learning material. Even if they were using it, they were learning. They were doing simultaneous equations, and a few questions to the students. They did not know how to divide or necessarily subtract. So at best, they could memorize a few properties of numbers and then get some points on the exam by it. So there are fundamental problems, and I think the fundamental political economy problems persist. And so while I'm arguing there are lots of workarounds and there are clever things that can be done and progress can be made, I don't want to detract from the fundamental importance of trying to figure out ways to address the political economy problems. So I'll end on that depressing note, or inspiring if you think you have ways of doing it. Thanks.
Here, in whichever chair you'd like, we can. All right. We'll take some questions now. Thank you for the enlightening discussion and the incredible work that you're doing and have done, and the progress that's been made, and also highlighting some of the challenges. So could we just you can just raise hands like we did in the previous session, and we can kick off the question and answer with Michael.
Thanks, Michael. That was great. I'm Gautam Rao. I'm a faculty member at UC Berkeley. One thing that struck me about the first two programs you described, both with the pipe water and, of course, deworming, is that the policy adoption and the scale-ups, in some sense, was very top-down, right? So you said the top level of the bureaucracy, someone got interested, there was coalition building. Your own work has shown, a lack of, say, willingness to pay, and that's kind of a stylized fact we find again and again, that people don't seem to be willing to pay for things that seem to benefit them, even though they seem to care about those outcomes in some ways. So how do we think about kind of bottom-up demand for, these policies, and perhaps even more ambitiously kind of demand from citizens for science and research? That's something I've been wondering about, in developing countries.
Thanks.
Right. So, yes, I completely agree with the premise of the question. And I'll just say a little bit on the democracy versus authoritarianism debate. This was not bottom-up in any way. Neither of these were bottom-up. There was bottom-up pressure to install pipes. There's not bottom-up pressure to make sure the water was clean. But this is, you can believe in representative government with the civil service, and the civil service, and at least the theory of this, is that the civil service is supposed to help the democratically elected government achieve its overall goals and work out the technical issues on things like deworming, which may not be a big voting issue in itself. So people who know India far better than me say I'm being crazily optimistic on this. But the particular civil servants I interacted with, I felt were able to do, were able to do a lot, and they were not, when I asked whether there was particular regions where it would be important to work on water issues, I got a very quick and very firm, no, you figure that out based on technical criteria, which I interpreted to mean there's no politics here whatsoever. I don't want to be favoring one state over another. So I think, you may, that system where democratically elected political leaders have some authority over civil servants, I know there's lots of concern about that and lots of problems associated with it, but it may have some virtues. But then in terms of bottom up, there's very interesting work that others are doing that I haven't done on bottom up science. And I think there's one area where that could be done is in agriculture, but there's some very exciting results in education suggesting that teaching teachers the scientific method and then having them teach that to their students can actually have pretty broad effects. And so that might be worth thinking about.
So, Michael, let me just follow up on the point about willingness to pay, because I think so maybe the examples you gave should rightfully always stay in the realm of the public delivery of these services. But the Indian government has been criticized for ramping up its public delivery. There's somebody quoted a figure around $400 billion of public resources going towards the public, and there's this general idea that the government is sort of over providing these resources to the population to buy votes, essentially. Can you, with regard to willingness to pay, do you think this is a problem? And do you think that, if any of these services, at some point the government takes them away, the public will react to, or will they anchor on, kind of zero or negative prices that they've seen for long duration?
I mean, so there may be plenty of things the government pays for and things the government shouldn't be doing. But I think in both of these, in all three of these examples, I feel pretty strongly there's a strong rationale for public provision. Yeah. Deworming is that's a communicable disease. There's positive externalities from taking deworming medicine. It's also just incredibly cheap and cost effective, and there's very strong evidence. And you can debate whether this is behavioral or not. I tend to think there is a behavioral component, but not everybody agrees that a lot of people, that even a very small, but the fact is clear, with even a very small price, people don't pay. And with clean water, very same story. And then with weather forecasting, this is just huge. Also in terms of the piped water, there's technical economies of scale in a piped water system. And with weather forecasting, obviously there's huge technical economies of scale, and there are there's asymmetric information problems that might mean that the government should. And there's at least a classic case why the government having a government weather forecast. But then, if you think about the actual institutions, they may not be working so well. So I think it's possible that the best solution on weather forecasting, AI techniques, weather forecasting techniques are getting really good. They're open source, which means you can produce customized weather forecasts that are optimized. You're minimizing a loss function for when is rainfall during the exact right period for a particular crop. So maybe you just should let the private sector do that and then support it with advertising or something like that, like the Weather Channel. But most of these examples, there's a very strong case for government involvement.
Hi, my name is Santosh Joyce, and I work for a company called Raytheon Technologies. In your experience, how do you see the role of, say, public-private partnerships working in India? Specifically over the past decade, there's an uptick in terms of the number of engagements, especially from companies around here in the United States, collaborating with the local governments there. How do you envision that working for, socioeconomic matters?
Well, so I'm going to give not a comprehensive answer to that because all sorts of very big projects, which I don't have any specialized knowledge of, but I do have some knowledge of the case of this tech company that produces software for community health workers. So that was actually a US-based company. It was selling internationally, but their biggest customer was in India. And what I would take from that, I didn't tell the full story, but the full story was they were serving community health workers that served 60 million people or something like that in India. And then the Indian government decided, we're not going to work with you anymore, we're turning to an Indian company. And I happened to talk to the people who ran that company, and I said, sorry to hear about this, or, must have been a disappointment. It was like, yeah, we were disappointed, but it wasn't that big a financial hit anyway because we weren't making any money there. And that makes, from the Indian government's point of view, the not making any money there makes complete sense because they're a monopsonistic buyer. Of course they're going to not pay more. And then if you put in, if you believe in industrial policy, which I don't know if I do, but if you believe in it, and there's certainly a case to be made that India has a comparative advantage in software development, and so maybe the decision to go with an Indian company was reasonable as well. I have no opinion on that. I'm not informed. But either way, the American company didn't make that much money out of this. And I think one lesson of that is that if you're talking about things to improve government services, that's a difficult area for international companies or probably even Indian companies to make a lot of money at. And that means too little resources. I mean, I'm going back to being an economist. Too few resources from a social point of view are going to go into that, and there's a strong case for philanthropic or government support for research on how to better deliver public services, including on tech. I mean, the weather forecasting is another example. Why aren't there already good weather forecasts for each of these crops?
I have a question. You have done right here, in the back here.
Yes.
You've done a lot of great work in Kenya as well, and the education sector in Kenya, So what lessons can we take to India from the enormous improvements Kenya seems to have made, in working with them? Where is India lagging compared to Kenya?
I think deworming was a policy adopted by both countries. So in that sense, and I think there are a lot of similarities. So let me start out by saying that, even though these are culturally very different. But I think one difference is and this is changing in Kenya, but Kenya was much more socially equal. Because there wasn't as much social division going. I mean, there's horizontal social division between ethnic groups, but there wasn't as much vertical social division. A few generations ago. So the social gap between teachers and students is much smaller, and that means that some of the issues, I think. Absence rates are probably, certainly income level adjusted absence rates are teacher absence rates are lower in Kenya than in India. And I think it's a little bit harder for the gap, there's a gap between where the curriculum that's set by the Ministry of Education and aimed at their kids is and where the typical student in the country is in Kenya as well as in India. but I think the gap's worse in India. So I think the social, where Kenya has an advantage is, at least for the time being, somewhat smaller social gaps. But they're trying to catch up to India.
All right. Thank you so much, Michael, for engaging with us and for your insights.
Okay.
Okay, we're going to turn it over to our last speaker now for a special lecture from our very own Karthik Muralidharan. Karthik is the Tata Chancellor's Endowed Professor of Economics at UC San Diego. He is one of the most foremost scholars in the world on the Indian economy, and he's worked tirelessly over nearly 2 decades on improving the delivery of basic education and healthcare services and public safety net programming to low-income individuals in India. His work has profound impacts on India's policymaking. His studies themselves often involve large parts of the populations of entire Indian states, which are each as large, as Karthik likes to say, as the population of several European countries put together. But beyond his path-breaking academic work, he's sought in a variety of ways to devote his time to driving systemic change, particularly in the bureaucracies of Indian states, which then affect the way that millions upon millions of individuals access public services. He is the co-founder of a nonprofit organization called the Center for the Effective Governance of Indian States, which is already embedded in the ministries of several large state governments and creating long-term positive impacts in how these organizations function and are funded. And he has recently published a book, which I have here, called Accelerating India's Growth. And I now use this as a regular part of my workout routine. This consolidates his career's worth of work in this area and proposes a roadmap for India to achieve its effective governance goals. It's a remarkable thesis, and I think it's indispensable reading for public policymakers and decision makers in the private sector as well. Thank you for being here with us, Karthik, and being part of the center and sharing your insights with us today.
No, thank you so much. It's an honor, privilege to be here, and I absolutely promise, I did not tee up Michael to say so much about the book. Okay, so I just happened to send him the book like a few weeks ago, and I guess he kindly read it on the way here. So anyway, it's a great pleasure. I'm delighted to see UCSD make this commitment to India, build the India Center, hire Ach as founding director. And we've had a bunch of faculty working in India, but I think the center kind of puts a bow around it all, and really just brings it together in a way that showcases not just the scholarship, but also the convening. Like we had the Assistant Secretary for State for South Asia here a couple of weeks ago. And so really kind of convening conversations, research, policy, practice, business. So anyway, I'm excited to be here, and I know I stand between you and whatever plans you have after this. And I have, it's going to be a heroic effort, taking 800 pages in 35 minutes. Okay, but people who know me know that this is kind of doable. Okay. So first of all, I have to thank Pranab. In many ways, I think it's just such an honor to be here with people like Pranab, and Michael's my advisor. The book is in many ways an ode to Pranab. He's been writing about these things in political economy, and a lot of these things are now backed up with more micro research. So the reason I wrote this book is really you learn so much from, academic economists don't write books, right? We do kind of deep individual papers, and in doing those papers, you learn so much that's tacit, that doesn't show up in the papers. And so once you have a body of work, there's dots worth connecting, and that's kind of why I've spent the time writing this book. Now, but we're not here just to talk about the book. We're here to really kind of make sense of India and where India is. And, there were optimistic takes or pessimistic takes. And as usual, like Joan Robinson famously said, and others have said about India, everything that is true, the opposite is also true, okay? And the way to make sense of that is when you have a 1.4 billion distribution, you can tell any story you want about India based on where in that distribution you sample, okay? So you can have some of the world's absolutely best cutting edge kind of achievers in technology, and you can have some of the world's greatest development challenges. challenges, okay? So, and as a professor, and this is not just conjecture, I'll show you a graph. As a professor, my grade for India is a solid B+, okay? And which reflects that, it's above average on many measures, average on measures, but you can do better, okay? And so that's kind of what this is about, which is, we are doing reasonably well, and how can we do better, okay? So what's the good news? The good news is in the global landscape, the Indian economy is doing reasonably well. It is the fastest growing large economy in the world, though that, there's COVID base effects, but it does grow fast. There's macro stability, okay, which is, again, not to be taken for granted, right? I mean, we've seen Sri Lanka, we've seen Latin America, we've seen, sometimes you take the basics for granted, and the fact that there's never been a macro crisis, never been a debt default, never been a foreign exchange crisis, these are all, it speaks to kind of certain basic housekeeping of the Indian state, like being run reasonably well. And the size obviously helps, the demographics in terms of youth helps, the democracy, despite all of its challenges, I don't think you can quite take voting rights away from Indians. I think they're kind of, it's too deeply ingrained, though you can kind of erode it in different ways. And then the diaspora, like Andrew said, right? That when you think about just the strength of the Indian diaspora, that is a huge asset, for the India story, okay? So there's a lot of reasons that India, regardless of what you think about it, whether it's great or bad, India cannot be ignored. Okay, so that's the good news. The bad news is it also faces profound challenges, and I think Pranab's already teed this up, right? So, and I think Ach said this in the beginning, so I don't need to repeat this, but again, you've got the largest number of malnourished and stunted children in the world. 35% of children under 5 are stunted. 50% of kids complete primary school in rural India without being able to read, okay? So these are both kind of moral tragedies because these are intrinsically bad because of what it means for limiting the prospects of these children. But they're also economic tragedies because they also hurt kind of the potential of the economy as a whole, okay? Same with, say, justice. We have a backlog of 30 million cases in our courts that keeps increasing every year. And there's this lovely paper recently by Manaswini showing how, just augmenting judge capacity, would pay for itself many times, okay? So, so these profound challenges. So for those of you who are investors who engage with India, want to understand India, think about India, the simple story about India is that there's kind of a top 10% that drives the economy, okay? So you've got top 10% with salaried jobs. And in that, I would say there's 1% with globally competitive jobs, okay? And when Qualcomm sets up its engineering facilities in India, these are people in the top 1%. You've got another 9% with salaried jobs. And so that top 10% of salaried jobs is what drives demand in the economy. You've got another 30% of people who are essentially providing services to that top 10%, okay? So that's kind of all of your informal economy with wage jobs, but they don't have a contract, okay? So, and then you've got about a bottom 50%, 50 to 60%, that's mainly left out of this process, who's primarily rural and kind of essentially, supported by welfare programs. And the basic political economy of India is the pressure for welfare and redistribution is basically how this story holds together, okay? Now, in many ways, this model has worked, okay? So before we start getting really pessimistic about India, at some macro level, 10% of 1.4 billion people is still a lot of people. 140 million is a large number, okay? So when people say India is a big market worth investing in, there is a real market there. There are real numbers, okay? It's just that the problem is that you can't function at full potential without firing on all engines, okay? And so which basically means to get from 6% or 7% to what would be full potential of 9 or 10% of what China and Vietnam, other or East Asia achieved, you can't do this without getting the bottom 50%, not just kind of being passive recipients of welfare, but kind of being active contributors to the growth process, both in terms of their own prospects and aggregate progress, okay? And so better human development is a critical enabler of this, and that is constrained by weak state effectiveness in delivering essential public services. So I think one way to just see the centrality of the governance challenges as the rate-limiting step for India getting to full potential is this nice quote from Rakesh Mohan, who is a former deputy governor of the Central Bank of India, of the Reserve Bank, and one of the architects of the 91 reforms. And so when he wrote an essay reviewing 25 years of reforms, he basically said, the way forward for accelerated growth is being held back by major governance deficits in all areas connected with the delivery of public goods and services, okay? And Lan Pritchett, who's always a bit more dramatic, essentially, said that, the weak performance of the Indian state is one of the 10 greatest challenges facing humanity, okay? And this reflects, I think, his not unreasonable view that given the scale of the problem and the number of people affected, this is in fact a problem that is first order, okay? So basically my assessment, and is that as we assess India at 75, there's perhaps no greater barrier to achieving full potential for its citizens than improving the effectiveness of the Indian state. Okay? Now, normally when people talk about poor health or poor education, the default approach is to say we need to expand social sector spending. Okay? But the problem is that improving human development is not just a matter of spending more in a government as usual way. Okay? So one of the key findings from so much research over the past 20 years is that a lot of the business as usual ways in which governments spend money does not translate into better outcomes. Okay? So that's problem one. And problem two is we don't have the money. Okay? So India has a tax to GDP ratio of 17.5%, which is half of the OECD of 35. So when the global education advocates say we need to spend 6% of GDP, that makes no sense, right? Because that's coming from an OECD norm where you have 35% tax to GDP ratio. So India, as a share of budget, spends exactly right, okay? So the issue is not how much you're spending, the issue is the quality of the spending, okay? So the main reason for writing this book is that I started my work 20 years ago in education, and then over the years working in health, working in welfare programs, the common fact that emerges across every one of these sectors is that the binding constraint, policy conversations happen at a sectoral level, but the binding constraint is really governance, which is common across every department, okay? So the fact that the stylized fact that motivated the book is this finding from study after study, is this finding from study after study across sectors, that the return on investment to investing in governance and state effectiveness is often 10 times more than just spending more money in a business as usual way, okay? So normally our public discourse on policy making focuses at the level of budget allocation, but not at the translation of that budget into impacts, okay? So much of my work over the past 20 years has been trying to match public spending to what's actually reaching the ground. So teacher absence is an exemplar of that, right? That's money you're spending on salaries that's not reaching. The leakage in NREGA is another measure of saying, let's look at what is spent and what reaches, okay? So when you think about the discourse not at the level of what's the top line of expenditure, but the bottom line of impact, you then realize that investing in the pipes is often way more effective than just spending more so the way I describe this is that the Indian state is like a 1950s ambassador car, okay? So just like that ambassador car was a metaphor for pre-liberalization economy, that is the metaphor for the Indian state, okay? So putting more money is a bit like putting more fuel in that 1950s car, okay? So it will move a little bit, but the translation of that budget into spending is very low because you need to re-engineer this car that is the Indian state, okay? And that's something that we haven't paid attention to since those early years after independence, okay? So for example, in education, where does most of the money go? Most of the money goes to unconditional increases in salaries, okay? And we've got very prominent papers showing that even doubling teacher pay unconditionally had zero impact, okay? But even a modest 3 to 5% increase in pay that is linked to performance ends up having huge effects. And that's not just my work, there's tons of papers showing that. Welfare programs, our work on biometric And yeah, I mean, this is for the non-academics in the audience. You should, I mean, like those papers are just listed to show that each of this is based on like about 10 years of work, right? Like, I mean, that's how long it takes to get one of these papers through the publication process, okay, right? Like, you know, but every piece of what I'm talking about is based on an enormous amount of primary work, okay? So biometric smart cards, corruption in India's welfare programs, again, we estimate that investing in reducing the leakage was about 10 times more effective because the reduction in leakage was 10 times higher than the cost of the program, okay? And in fact, we estimate that the market effects on the wages from NREGA of improving implementation was as big as the program itself, okay? So the best estimates of the Imbert and Papp estimates of market wages from NREGA is about the same as what we get from improving implementation, okay? So, and we see this in education. We have a recent JPE paper coming out just showing that augmenting state capacity by hiring a local staff member, like who's accountable, is kind of has an ROI of 10 to 20x, okay? But where does the money go? The money again goes to unconditional pay increases of incumbents, which has absolutely no impact, okay? We've seen this in farmer welfare, we've seen this now in the judiciary, okay? So given all of this, what it suggests is that there are huge returns to kind of thinking seriously about the state and how do you invest systematically in improving state effectiveness, okay? So kind of scholars of India who kind of think from a political economy lens, so here's Rohini and and Page in 2018 in a JP paper. And in fact, I didn't find this till recently because I wish I had, because it motivates the book beautifully, right? So it says, we argue for research that unpacks the state. We believe that micro-level evidence can inform system-level reforms, but to do so effectively requires engaging with the political economy of reform, okay? And then Devesh Kapoor has this very nice quote in his JP piece where he says, most economists actually study the state as an institution. You kind of look at variation in institutional quality and look at variation in outcomes. But the problem is that's almost tautological, because you kind of say variation in outcomes reflects variation in state capacity. It doesn't tell you how do I improve the state capacity, and that requires you to get into the black box of the state and look at the state as an organization and not as an institution, okay? So what the book is doing in many ways is kind of responding to this call. And it's set in like 18 chapters, okay? And for people from India, like, you know, that's not a complete coincidence, okay? Right? Like, you know, it just kind of happened, all right? And so the structure here is there's this intro chapter that's talking about this centrality of state capacity as the binding constraint for every development goal, okay, that we have as a country. But then before getting into the technocratic core of the book, which is section 2 and 3, it starts with kind of looking at the key actors, the incentives and constraints of the politicians and the bureaucrats, okay? So what I want to do here is, I think, take 5 minutes before we get into the innards of the Indian state to take a 500-year historical view, okay, and situate India in kind of global historical context, okay? And so what I want you to do here is just kind of highlight that the modern nation state itself has evolved through 3 major waves, okay? So for most of human history, the state was essentially what I call a security state, okay? So the only thing nation states did was essentially defense and law and order, okay? That was it. And one way to see that is that 70 to 80% of budgets were often going to defense, even in 17th century Europe, okay? So historical analysis of budgets of Egypt and Rome will again show you that it's about 80%. So it's not that they didn't build roads, but the roads were built for military reasons with some spillovers, but the focus was always defense and strategic, okay? So it's only in the 18th and 19th century that you get the second wave of what I call the industrial state, okay? And where it's not an accident that this happens at the same time as the Industrial Revolution, and now states start kind of massive investments in roads and railroads and storage and public goods and infrastructure. And the reason it goes with the Industrial Revolution is that's the first time you have such large economies of scale in production that it then makes sense to produce in a few centralized locations at scale and invest in the transport to integrate markets, okay? So till then, a lot of your production is decentralized, and it doesn't make sense to actually have this massive kind of infrastructure build out, okay? So that's the second phase. And this is when you, for the first time in human history, you have increases in per capita income, okay? So till then, for 3,000 years, as people like Greg Clark have shown us, that most of the growth was extensive growth, right? You get growth and that gets absorbed by increase in population. So it's only with the Industrial Revolution that you get increases in per capita income, okay, like for the first time. But the problem is that that comes with significant increase in inequality, right? So most of that growth is benefiting people who own land, finance, and are educated, right? So physical capital, financial capital, human capital is who benefits from that growth, okay? So then it's only in the last 100 years that you get the third phase of the state, which is the welfare state, okay? So the modern welfare state is a remarkably recent phenomenon in human history. It shows up around 1930s with the Depression and picks up in a big way after World War II, because the welfare states are really expensive, okay? So funding the welfare state requires not only for countries to be rich, but it requires the taxing and fiscal capacity, and the willingness to be taxed went up only during the time of the war, right? So the war effort is what built the fiscal capacity, and then the peace dividend after the war gets paid back as the modern welfare state, okay? So the welfare state, in terms of expenditure as a ratio of GDP, really is a post-World War II phenomenon, okay? Now, the subtle point about this, and so then you get food security, healthcare, pensions, unemployment insurance. This is really only 75 years old, okay? Now, here's the subtle point. 2 key points. One is most OECD countries and high-income states built a welfare state only after reaching middle-income status, okay? After reaching an income of about $20,000, okay? So that's one fact. The second key fact, which is underappreciated, is the extent to which the nature of the state is correlated with the extent of democracy itself. So security states happen at times of no democracy, no sense of individual rights, okay? Now, what's interesting about the industrial state is the industrial state happens in a time of limited democracy, okay? So the UK and the US like to think of themselves as these great old democracies, right? But in the 19th century, these are highly flawed democracies with votes restricted to 20% of the population, essentially white property-owning men, okay? And so it's not an accident that now in the long term, the roads and the railroads help the poor through market integration and lower prices. But in the short term, it's all capitalized in the property prices, okay? So it's not an accident that land-owning, property-owning class is where you get the political support, okay, like I mean for building out the infrastructure. And it's not an accident that it's only when you get universal adult franchise that you get the modern welfare state, because in any income distribution, if you're left of the median, you want more redistribution and lower taxes. If you're right, and higher taxes. If you're right, you want lower taxes, okay? And that's the core tension of US politics even today. So given the polarization in Congress, what is the one bill that passes with bipartisan consensus? It's the transportation bill, right? And that's because you can see the unification, it unifies these two segments of kind of the modern Republican Party that really represents the 19th century view of what the state should spend on, right? Like, I mean, and the modern Democratic Party, like, you know, which represents in some ways the 20th century view of what the state should be doing, okay? But that is the core tension in the politics, okay? Now, why am I giving you this kind of crash course of global political history? It's because you need this to make sense of India. Because India is this incredible outlier in human history that is the only country that had universal adult franchise on day one, okay, of independence. And that fundamentally changes the trajectory of the political economy and development of the country, okay? So here's this figure from it's a very nice paper by Arvind Subramaniam and Rohit Lamba in the JP, and they just quantify what I think intuitively a bunch of us have known and talked about, but it's a very powerful picture. So this is just showing you on a democracy index of 0 to 10, where roughly this corresponds to the fraction of people who have the vote, okay? So when the US and the UK were at comparable levels of income as India, right, they were at an index of about 2.5, roughly, and in about 1810, okay? Whereas India gets democratic early and stays democratic. Now, what is the implication of this? The implication, so at one level, this is a huge moral triumph, okay? It's a moral triumph because you're giving a voice to the most marginalized in your polity at a time when high-income countries, today's high-income countries didn't do that, okay? And it's not just a moral triumph, you also get a policy triumph. Like, again, there's a lot of micro evidence showing the franchise correlates with welfare. Like, so I think Tom Fujiwara's Econometrica paper is probably one of the best modern, well-identified pieces of evidence, but this has been shown by political scientists in a bunch of, you know, more correlational stuff, okay? But one example of this is the US does food stamps for the poor, okay, does SNAP in the 1930s at a GDP per capita that is 2011 inflation adjusted of about $18,000 per capita, okay? India does PDS for the poor at a corresponding income of about $1,200, okay, which means the US is 15 times richer than India when it does food security for the poor, okay? So that's the sense in which this is a great moral triumph, right? But we're economists, and so we know, like, I mean, that there's no free lunch, and so there's a trade-off. And so while it's a great moral triumph, it comes with two fundamental costs, okay, and challenges. So the first is a public finance challenge, right, which is there's just limited tax money. And remember, like, when you're poor, your tax to GDP ratio is much poorer. So when people are poor, we often think the government should do a lot, but when the people are poor, the government is also poor. Then the government is relatively even more poor because the tax to GDP ratio is in fact much lower, okay? So the first problem and the challenge, therefore, is that the political pressure to do welfare, before you had built even a modest level of income and fiscal and state capacity, means that you just don't invest in kind of the productive capacity or the capacity of the state itself. So a different way of framing the question for an economist is, when I'm giving you all of these 10x ROI kind of ideas, why is it not happening? Why are these $100 bills on the sidewalk? And the $100 bills on the sidewalk, because the political incentives, like I mean, point towards visible short-term welfare as opposed to kind of the longer-term investments in productive state capacity. Okay, so that's problem number one. Problem number two is then the political economy challenge, okay? So, which is, what you've done is democracy before development is a moral triumph, okay? But what it's done is it's given every citizen the capacity to make a claim on the state before the state has the capacity to meet those claims. And so what that does is it changes the nature of your politics, okay? Where the nature of the politics is a politics of scarcity, where that it all becomes about how do I direct the limited resources of the state towards my group, okay? So like when you study clientelism, right, what in political science, is well known, I think a core point is that it's in a world where voters and politicians both rationally know that the state doesn't have the resources for everyone, it becomes optimal to say, how do I get the resources of the state towards my group? And then you get a vicious cycle between what's called vote bank politics, right? And low state capacity, because low state capacity means you can't serve everybody. And because that gives you vote bank politics, you then don't invest in the state, okay? So that's kind of, so it seems like a really difficult problem to get out of, okay? So now, but there is reason to be optimistic. Okay? So where does the optimism come from? It comes from the fact that if you look at the patterns in Indian election data, okay, it's starting to become clear that there is an old politics of identity and polarization, okay, and that's not gone, right? But that old politics gets you 20% of the vote, okay? But to get that next 20%, which you need to win elections, you need to start delivering, okay? Because people are now much more educated, there's much better access to information, and so there is political pressure to deliver, okay? And so the question therefore is, how do you deliver? And what you're seeing right now, that's why the investments in the biometrics and the cash transfers, so part of the effective politicians have figured out that there is a welfare vote, right? I mean that if I can get services effectively to people. So I think what the governments have done in the past decade is succeeded in services where you can disintermediate the human, but they have not yet managed to succeed in essential services that are human intermediated, right? So when it's education, when it's health, when it's rule of law, these are all human intermediated services, and that's a problem we have not yet cracked, okay? So the good news is that I believe that there is a window. And even senior civil servants tell me, they say, Karthik, you normally go talk to the bureaucrats, but in fact the politician is your ally because the politician is under pressure to deliver in a way the bureaucrat is not, okay? So they are in fact willing to listen to good ideas that will help you improve outcomes, okay? So the reason I'm giving you this preface is the middle of the book is technocratic, but if I just started with that, people would say this is some armchair ivory tower economist with kind of no understanding of political realities and like, what's he smoking, okay? But it turns out like, I mean that there is, so the hope here is that there is a window, okay, to then act on the technocratic advice of how do you actually build a more effective state, okay, which is then the intellectual core of the book, right, which is the next 6 chapters. So it's really 2 halves, right? And then once you do this, so, and I'm not going to have time to do all of this, but a lot of this is just kind of, it's coming partly from my private sector experience, partly from thinking about organizations, that effective organizations are characterized by, there's really 3 core things, right? Which is data and what outcomes are you orienting towards? Anybody in the private sector is like, what is the quarterly goal? What is the target? What are we measuring? Okay, so what happens in government today is you measure on compliance and you measure on inputs, and that's why you get that, but you don't measure on outcomes. So in a way, like investing in data, and I'll give you a slide on that, is a fundamental piece. Second is personnel. So any org is only as effective as its people. And for the citizen, the state are the government employees, okay? So, and public sector personnel management is so horrendously bad, like I mean that there's just incredible low-hanging fruit. The third pillar is public finance, which is how you're spending your taxpayer money. And what I'm going to show you is there is so much low-hanging fruit in how you could improve that. And then there's kind of, the government is obviously revenue, and one thing that's kind of important for a place like India is it's not just that the tax to GDP ratio is 17.5%. It's not just the quantity of revenue, it's also the quality of revenue, okay? And what I mean by that is what economists call the marginal cost of public funds, which is how much does it cost you to raise every dollar, and that ends up being much higher in low-income countries. So in the US, that's estimated to be 1.3 to 1.7. In India, that's estimated to be 2.5 to 3, and that's because when you have high informality, tax collection is much more expensive, okay? So what that means is that there is a huge margin of improving welfare if you can improve the quality of revenue, which is something nobody thinks about because most government civil servants are chasing revenue targets. They're not measuring the downstream distortions to economic activity from the choice of revenue instruments, okay? Pranab's already talked about federalism, which is, India is the most over-centralized country in the world, and that again reflects colonial origins, right? Because remember, the modern Indian state is built on the skeleton of a colonial state that was designed to rule and not designed to serve, okay? So which meant that every aspect of the administration was built on kind of lack of trust for the frontline employee, and so it's a culture of command and control. So when we say it's over-centralized, because that represents that 1% of British employees, like who were basically governing the country, okay? So it reflects that legacy, and it reflects a bunch of other legacies as well, okay? And so the bottom line is that we preserved some of the colonial relics which helped preserve the unity of the state, but it meant that we haven't fully built a state that can transition from one that was designed to rule the people to one that is able to serve the people the way a modern democratic state should do, okay? And then the last pillar of this is the state and the market, which is part of the consequence of public failure is that education is about 50% private in urban areas. Health is about 70% private. And the government still thinks about its job as running the public healthcare system. Whereas in many cases like Jishnu and Asim and Tahir's work has shown, some of the most important interventions can be low-cost interventions that make markets work better, okay, with better information. And so there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that governments can act on, which they don't even think about because they think of their job as running the public system, and they think of the private thing as something that happens there on the side, okay? So these are then the building blocks of that. So let me just give you one slide from those 3 chapters. So here is, I think, it's just a simple but stunning figure, okay? So if you're a pilot or a driver, your ability to fly a plane is only as good as the instruments and the data that you're seeing, okay? And what this picture shows on learning outcomes is this is the data on official learning levels, okay? If you look at the official data reported on learning levels in Hindi, you'll see that there is no learning crisis because every child is getting above 60%, okay? So this is ordered from lowest to highest, and everybody's doing great. And then this is a very simple study that my colleague Abhijit Singh did by doing a random audit and retesting a bunch of these kids on the same questions in the official data within a couple of months, and you find that the true learning level is actually here. So in the official data, there's nobody who scores less than 60%. In the true data, there's nobody who scores more than 60%. Okay, and it's funny, but it's a tragedy, right? This is how we have wasted 20 years as a country. We have wasted 20 years as a country because independent nonprofits like Pratham from 2005 have been doing independent citizen-based measurement, saying that there is a learning crisis, okay? But the government machinery officially cannot respond to that because they have to act on their official data. So unofficially, the Joint Secretary will say, yes, we know this is right, but my hands are tied. I have to only go by the official data. And the official data is garbage, okay? And now every researcher knows this, and that's why we collect our own data. But in terms of policy, if you want to build public systems, this is the foundation, okay? So we talk about nutrition. Now, this is a case where the policy document is fantastic, where they say if you find a severely malnourished child, you need to provide additional supplemental nutrition, okay? But to trigger that chain of action, you have to classify the child as malnourished in the first place. And we find that the true rate of severe malnutrition is like 8%, and in the official data, it's under 1%, okay? So you're just not classifying them. So then the downstream policy cannot even come into effect, okay? So, which is why data is the foundational investment in building a more effective state, okay? Personnel, any org, right, is only as effective as its people. And unlike kind of common views is that the Indian government is remarkably understaffed. You have only 16 employees per 1,000 compared to 10 times higher in Europe and about 5 times in India, in the US. And the reason for that, there's many reasons, but one big reason is Indian government employees are the most overpaid in the world, okay? So except the very, very top, this is kind of from one of my studies in AP education where you see that the average government school teacher is paid about 6 times more than the market wage, okay? And so the one-line summary of public sector employment in India is we pay way too much and we hire way too few. Okay? And that reflects a political economy where the insiders are so powerful that they kind of grab most of the resources every time there's a pay increase, leaving no money like for anything else. Okay? And so that kind of feeds nicely into what I consider a very simple but powerful way of thinking about quality of public expenditure, okay? Which is one of the things that research over the last 20 years has allowed us to do is take major spending programs and just classify them. Normally I make fun of consultants and I don't like 2x2s, okay? But this is a 2x2 that really works, okay? Which is, you can just think about expenditure quality on an axis of efficiency and equity, okay? Now, normally if I'm teaching public finance in the US, it's considered almost axiomatic that there's a trade-off between equity and efficiency, okay? Because in general, redistribution involves efficiency costs because raising taxes has costs, and then when you redistribute, you're hurting incentives, okay? So normally, like Tom Sargent, when he gave his graduation talk at Berkeley, literally said that one of the 12 rules of economics is there's a trade-off between equity and efficiency, okay? But I think what makes being a development economist so much fun is that all of development economics is about showing that when you have people close to subsistence, when you're close to poverty traps at the individual or national level, it's possible for well-designed interventions to improve both equity and efficiency, okay? So some of the most iconic papers in development are papers that show that, okay? So the good news is that it's possible using research and evidence to identify classes of expenditure that are here. The bad news is so much of our expenditure is here that is bad for both equity and efficiency, okay? So, like Pranab in his 1984 classic, right? I mean, just highlights how most of the public expenditure in India is kind of captured by three groups of elites, okay? There's big businesses, large landowners, and government employees, okay? So, and those are the three groups that are politically so powerful, right? Mainly because of their ability to finance elections and influence large number of voters, okay? So, if you look at where the money goes, like free electricity for farmers is literally one of the worst policies in the world, okay? Because it's bad for equity. The top 5% of landowners get about 50% of the money. It's bad for efficiency in terms of cropping patterns, and it's a disaster for the environment for a whole variety of reasons, okay? But it's politically really, really hard to touch, okay? So all of these unconditional pay increases for incumbent, all of those policies sit here. Loan waivers for big corporates, they all sit here, right? Bad for equity, bad for efficiency. So just kind of having this lens on our public expenditure can help kind of move the discourse towards saying, how do we kind of, we can do more of everything, whereas most of our public discourse is fighting on R2 versus R4. And what I'd like to do is to kind of say, okay, reasonable people can disagree on this quadrant, but can we identify what's here and make the money to go here, okay? So that's really kind of a big part of what this is a foundational conceptual framework, but each chapter then identifies research-based ideas, right? Like that will allow us to identify expenditure items in R3 so that we can fund massively underfunded programs here in R1, okay? So why does this matter? And the reason this matters is, which is then the second half of the book, because if I was just doing this at a conceptual level, it might be exciting for governance geeks who care about state capacity. But most people in the world don't care abstractly about state capacity. They care about real development outcomes. They care about education, they care about health, they care about welfare. And so that's what the second half is doing, is then translating those principles into how do you accelerate development. So let me take another big picture detour. This is just 2 minutes, okay? And this is just recapping one of the most important debates in development over the past 50 years, okay? Which is what's called the growth versus development debate. And basically, every major development indicator you look at, life expectancy, infant mortality, education, it's positively correlated with income, okay? So rich countries do better, rich states do better, okay? So one view is to say, listen guys, in the long term, nothing matters more than growth. You get 2% higher growth for a year for 30 years, everything else will take care of itself, okay? And that even the growth in education in India in the last 25 years has nothing to do with supply side interventions. It has to do with increasing returns to education coming from higher growth and people choosing to get better educated, okay? So Land Pritchett very colorfully says, right, that demand and supply matter for outcomes as much as gin and tonic matter for getting you drunk, okay? Like it means so, right, like, you know, so that it's all about demand. It's demand, and that demand is going to be driven by kind of what's happening in the economy, okay? Now, so that's the growth view, right? But then the and that's kind of, the contra-development view, which is famously attributed to Amartya Sen, is that the point of development is not GDP, okay? We're not trying to develop for this abstract concept of GDP. The point of development is to increase human agency and empowerment to give people a better quality life. And in that view, things like education, health, agency, democracy, right, all matter. And so what they will say is, if you look at, say, for example, Sri Lanka, and the US, that's a very stark example. So in the year of COVID, okay, actually Sri Lanka had a slightly higher life expectancy than the US, even though the US has 15 times higher GDP per capita. Okay? And so that's kind of an extreme example of how much better you can do on human development by building public systems that kind of focus on the marginalized and focus on the left tail of the distribution. Okay? So in the Sen and Dres view, like it is, you don't have to wait to get rich to get developed. You can get developed by making conscious policy choices that highlight the social sector. Okay? So this has been the great development debate for 50 years. And broadly, in the Indian context, it's people like Jagdish Bhagwati and Panagaria who are most associated with the growth view, and Dres and Sen with the development view. And in the global development agencies, the World Bank and IMF historically had been more growth wallas, and the UN, UNDP, UNICEF have usually been kind of the folks on the development side. Now, So what I'm trying to do is, my point of departure in this debate is to say, guys, at some level they're both right, okay? So clearly more growth helps human development, more human development helps growth. So what are we fighting about? It's basically kind of a fight on direction and causality, and in practice it ends up being an ideological issue, okay, which is the center right likes more infrastructure and growth, center left likes more social sector and redistribution, okay? And so my point of departure in this debate is to say this fight is still a zero-sum fight about budget allocation. But there is so much inefficiency in how you translate that spending into outcomes that if you focus on the productivity of the public spending, you can do more of everything, okay? So one way to connect this to, say, macro development is the cross-country estimates that say about 20% of variation is K, right? 20 to 30% is H, and the rest is TFP, right? So if TFP is the big guy in the room, you can think about the growth and infrastructure push as the K, the social sector push as the H, and what I'm pushing for is being the TFP story. But the difference is, unlike Solo, who's saying TFP is a measure of our ignorance, I'm kind of following more a Bloom Van Reenen view of saying we can actually get into the black box of that TFP and kind of give you concrete ways of improving the productivity of the state, okay? So that's kind of intellectually where I'm situating the book in the development discourse, okay? Now, why does this matter? Because what you want to do is the goal is if you can improve, and this is why I said India is a solid B+. I'm not making it up, okay? So India is actually slightly above average on every development measure cross-country. We do exactly, the education numbers seem bleak, nutrition numbers seem bleak, but they're not that bleak once you adjust for GDP per capita, okay? So they're exactly at or above, and that's why it's a B+ or even A-, okay, in some ways. So the question is, how do you accelerate? And my conjecture is that if you improve the effectiveness of spending, you can move up at any given level of spending, and that will give you a feedback into faster growth, okay? So that's what you're hoping for. So, and the reason to be optimistic is this famous kind of graph that Angus Deaton popularized of shifting the Preston curve, and this just shows that over this period, over 30 years from 1930 to 1960, that countries at the same level of GDP per capita were, so essentially poor countries in 1960 had much better life expectancy than countries at the same level of GDP per capita, and that's mainly because there was new knowledge and new technologies, okay? So 100 years ago, you could be the son of the President of the United States. So exactly in 1924, Calvin Coolidge's son died from a blister in his toe, okay? And that was just something that could be cured by a simple antibiotic, which today a daily wage laborer can access for a few pennies, okay? So it's the new technologies that have allowed us to improve human possibilities, and we've done the most of this in health, because health has the best tradition of evidence-based aggregation of ideas that then get deployed at scale. The question is, how can we now do this for governance more broadly? And that's why that chapter that transitions to the sectors is called Shifting the Preston Curve for Development. And the question is, what do we have today that today's rich countries did not have at the same level of historic GDP per capita? And we have much better data and evidence, and we have much better technology that can help guide, improve effectiveness of spending, okay? So there's enormous opportunities to improve spending quality. We have many very expensive policies that have no impact, other much less expensive interventions that are highly effective, and that's what Michael effectively, all of those interventions is exactly speaking to this, right? And so what I'm saying is we've got this opportunity to do all of this stuff, but then to take it to scale in a systematic way then requires us to build the public systems that will allow us to institutionalize being able to act on these ideas and kind of build a more effective state, okay? Now, why does this matter? I'm going to skip this slide. Okay, so this is what the projections for stunting look like, okay? So we are at 35% today. If you take the income elasticity, the time series income elasticity of how income growth has translated to reduced stunting and project that to 2047, at 6% per capita, you will still have 25% stunting in 2047, okay? So this is the period that the Prime Minister calls Amrit Kal as the period that is kind of the window of the demographic dividend. And we'll still have 25% stunting if you continue at this rate. Now, even if you get growth up to 8%, even at 8%, this only falls to 22, okay? And this, by the way, is an upper bound of what would happen if I increase sectoral budget allocation, because even if I manage to increase a sectoral budget allocation by 2% a year on 6% growth, that's the same as the same budget at 8% growth, okay? So sectoral increases are not going to do this for you. But if you manage to double the income elasticity of how income growth translates into outcomes, then even at 6%, you get here to 17. And now doubling is heroic, but it's not crazy because there are so many ideas that have 10x ROI, 20x ROI that we're not acting on. And I'm being realistic by only assuming this for future spending, okay? Not assuming that we're going to repurpose old spending. And then if this manages to feed back to 8% growth, then you're down here at 13%. In education, at the current rate in 2047, we'll still have 16% of kids who can't read. And if you do this, you accelerate and bring that process forward to about 2034. And again, the consequences for welfare are staggering because it's not just when you get there, but you've got to integrate the number of kids under this curve. And so on the status quo, under current projections, you will have 200 more million kids in the next 25 years who graduate from school without being able to read. You grow at 8%, that comes down to 160. You double the elasticity going forward, you come here, and that feeds back to 8% and you get here. But let me again just tell you, this is not a pipe dream. Why is this possible? Because this picture, why does data and evidence, why is this so powerful? Okay, so I consider this picture perhaps the most, this is coming from a brand new paper of ours on EdTech and learning. So I consider this maybe the most important picture to understand developing country education. So what's going on here is on the x-axis, you have the grade in which kids are enrolled. The y-axis is their true learning level. So if they were making progress at the curricular progress, they would be on this 45-degree line. In practice, the true level of progress is here at the red line, which means that the average 8th grader has about a 4th grade level of math learning. Okay? But it's not just the average. What the dynamic computerized testing lets you do is it lets you measure every kid. And so now you can see that you have kids in that 8th grade classroom. There are kids at a 2nd grade level, at a 3rd, at a 4th, all the way up to the 8th. And this reflects the fact that you've had a well-intentioned no detention policy that wants to prevent dropouts but keeps kids in school regardless of whether they're learning. Okay? And so what happens here, this is why all of your expenditure increase doesn't matter. क्योंकि अभी इस व्याख्यान के बीच में अगर मैं एक दूसरी भाषा में बात करने लगा तो मैं जितना भी क्वालिफाइड हूँ, जितना भी मोटिवेटेड हूँ, जितना भी सिंसियरली पढ़ाता हूँ, आपको कुछ समझ में नहीं आएगा. क्यों समझ में नहीं आएगा? और मैं ऐसा क्यों कर रहा हूँ? इसलिए कर रहा हूं ताकि आपको कुछ लम्हों के लिए महसूस हो कि दुनिया के लाखों पाठशालाओं में हर दिन हर बच्चे को क्या महसूस होता होगा. So what have I just done to you? Okay? So what I've done is I've given you 25 seconds in the shoes of a typical kid in a typical classroom in millions of schools around the world. Because you're sitting there, and if the content is above your level of comprehension, it doesn't matter how qualified the teacher is, how motivated the teacher is, I might as well be teaching a different language. Okay? And there's probably 20% of kids in this class who understood. And that's also exactly what would happen, right? And then I would look at those who understood and saying, smart kid, and that's where I would focus. But the point is, this kind of data we just didn't have till recently, right? And so once you have this kind of data, you know that the reason your business as usual spending is not translating into outcomes is it's not addressing the binding constraint. Okay? And then I can give you lots of kind of positive examples. But the point here is just kind of highlight the power of the research and the evidence to accelerate development. And if we act on that, we can do much better. Okay? So my last, so this is then just, showing the full outline of the book. And what I want to say is it looks big, but it's very accessible. Okay. So I want to say two more things. Why have I picked these 6 sectors? The sectors of education, skills, health, police, courts, social protection, and jobs. Is because, again, we spend so much of our time on ideological fights about what should the government prioritize, okay? But the beauty of these 6 sectors is in that great Bhagavati Sen debate, we don't have to choose, okay? Because every one of these sectors are intrinsically important for human welfare. Okay? So being more educated or being healthier is intrinsically good, even if it doesn't make you more productive. But it's also instrumentally good because it's going to make you, and it's going to make you more productive, and it's also going to contribute to growth. So you don't have to fight a growth development debate. You just, if you can improve the effectiveness of how we translate spending into outcomes, you can do more of everything. And then, of course, like Pranab said, all of this is a technocratic middle of the book. But it's bookended by politics and society, okay? Because at the end of the day, all the technocratic economic advice doesn't get translated into impact, into action, unless you align the incentives of the key stakeholders, okay? So part of my conjecture here at the beginning is there's enough change in the political economy that there are incentives to act on this. So like Michael said, right? Simple example. Everybody says you can't fix public procurement because there's too much corruption. But what Oriana's famous paper shows is that only 17% of corruption, of waste is actually corruption. The rest is inefficiency. Okay? So there is so much low-hanging fruit that you can pick on that there is huge support for, right? You just need to kind of know what to do and get it done. And so let me just end by saying that there's three constituencies, three audiences for the book. Okay? The first is kind of the professional community of development economists. And the goal here is to just try to bring the question of state capacity back to the core of development itself. Okay? Which is, the way I think about this is for a couple of decades after World War II, most economists were focusing on what should governments do without asking how will they do it or can they even do it. Okay? And that gives you kind of the Bill Easterly type of white man's burden of all of these well-designed projects that fail because you haven't really thought about implementation issues. What's I think happened in the last 30-odd years is people and donors have recognized that there is state capacity is a problem, but they also think it's a problem they can't fix. And so you end up with kind of building project management units around specific interventions that are donor funded, where you use research and RCTs to inform that this is worth doing. But all of the donor funded spending at the end of the day is less than 1% or 2% of national budgets. Okay? So the elephant in the room is the government budget itself. And for every major development goal, it is state capacity that is the binding constraint. Okay? So what I want to do is just urge students and people working on development to bring back this issue of implementation and state capacity to the center of what we focus on in development. Okay, so that's one audience. The second is just policymakers. So every chapter is what I call half science and half engineering, where the half is science of saying, let's make sense of the facts, and the other half is saying, now what are we going to do based on this understanding? And the third and final audience is just citizens and anybody who just wants to understand issues of governance and find an accessible way to get a synthesis of a whole bunch of research. So let me stop there, and thank you for indulging me.
Amazing. So, speaking of binding constraints, because of our time, we won't have time for formal Q&A right now, but what we'll do is we will adjourn, and there's a few minutes where we can mingle outside in the courtyard. I'm sure you guys have many things to unpack with Karthik, and so we'll let you do that. And so I just wanted to say a word in closing. I want to thank everyone for coming, especially our panelists, our keynote speaker, Michael Kremer, and our special lecturer, Karthik Muralidharan, for their incredible insights and their discussion, and for you all to be here today and be part of this community. We really hope that you continue to engage with the 21st Century India Center to have more events and convenings such as this one. So thank you so much, and look forward to chatting with you all outside.